This is Audible.
And now, Part 4 of the Recognitions, written by William Gaddis and read by Nick Sullivan.
"Hello," he said. A sound which took all of his energy, left him unable to add the word father. "Aha," said the other, looking round him quickly through the thick glasses, pulling the cane up under his arm, hardly pausing to shake hands. "Everything all right?" he murmured, going on in toward the bar. "Why, yes, You better take my arm. It looks better." "Why, yes, I'm sorry, of course." Otto guided him in, and they paused. "Do you want to have a drink first? A drink at the bar?" Otto managed to ask, staring over a sagging shoulder at the sagging charm of Jean at the bar. "I don't think. Too many people at the bar, anyhow. We'll get a table." Otto followed, looking back over his own sagging shoulder at the bar. "It isn't really crowded," he said. His companion turned, and for the first time fixed him with sharp pupils which seemed to penetrate him. "You're not drunk, are you?" "Drunk? I? Why, no, That would be a nice stew." A lonely waiter appeared to show them to a table in one corner, felicitously almost dark. Otto walked with a slight limp in time to the march of the Sardar, which came from the hidden amplifiers. The cane before him kept similar time. Passing an occupied table, Otto looked with horror at the man seated there, not at the man, perhaps, but at his tie. The inquisitorial stripe still challenged him. He still felt eligible, or had until this moment. The glance of the man at the table was cursory, from Otto to the grotesque striding before him, the glance of the British resident as the two ruined nobles followed the crippled clamor of their music toward the south. They were imprisoned side by side behind a table against the wall. "You shouldn't have jumped like that when you met me." "Oh, did I?" "It just don't look good." "I know, People notice things like that." "I know." The waiter dropped menus before them and escaped. We might as well start right off with dinner." "You want to eat?" I thought we were going to. I guess it doesn't really matter." It was difficult for Otto to study the figure beside him. Nevertheless, he tried, beyond the bushy hair and the heavy glasses. Otto wanted to see his teeth. "It's funny," he said. "You have such black hair." "What's so funny about it?" Because mine is so light," Otto answered, as the cane clattered to the floor. "Is it on crooked?" his companion asked in a low tone, raising his hand to his brow and passing it delicately over his temple. "I've been kind of rattled all evening," he said, "since I left home." "Why? Is anything wrong at home?" "He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding. But he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. I'd just done something sort of hasty, like the Bible says there. But stupidity gets me sometimes. I just blow up." He sat back, then, and appeared to relax. "That's dangerous in any business, let alone this one." "Yes," said Otto. "Of course." He held the large menu card up as a screen for his confusion, increased now by a scent which crept up around him, a familiar, fugitive aroma which he could not identify. He was not reading the menu, but anticipating, as though reality, in any desperate measure, would suffice to anchor his covetousness. And he did not dare look up at the bar for Jean. "Clams gros to start? Or omelette aux truffes?" "But those things don't hardly seem to matter tonight. I feel in a nice mood." "Coq au vin? Pigeon au petit pois? Poularde au riz? Sauce suprême? I always feel this way after a good job, and Christmas all over the place." The lonely waiter appeared, and he silenced. foie gras à la gelée de poteau, poulet, fond d'artichaut, salade à la grecque. Hamburger steak, sounded beside him, and the music was Mozart's Turkish waltz. Where had he found that? Otto realized that he was looking at the wine list. As he folded the huge card back upon itself, the voice said, "Same thing for you?" "Yes, 2 hamburger steaks, well done. And hurry it up." Albert, King of the Belgians, careening gloriously down among the crevices of rock, gone, never to reappear and interrupt legends offered about him, to suffer translation from the fiction of selective memories to the betrayal of living reality. Otto looked at the heavy glasses, saw dust on the surfaces of the lenses. "I noticed your eyes. Are they, very bad? They really look—" "Esserine." "Oh. Is it contagious? Is it dangerous?" "Dangerous? It's not dangerous." "But is it painful?" "No. You can feel it, but it's not painful." "Oh." Otto folded his hands before him. "Is it hereditary, do you know?" he asked, looking up. "Is it what?" How did you get it? I got it from a friend of mine." "Oh," said Otto, and sat a bit further away. Then he said agreeably, "I suppose you wonder what I've been doing with myself." "Keeping busy, I guess," was the answer in an uninterested tone. Otto looked down at his hands and reconsidered. "What have you been up to lately?" "I'm working on a passport now. It's no job for a beginner. It never was work for bums to get into. They ruin it for the real craftsman." "Yes, I guess it's like that in everything, but passports? What are you—" The lonely waiter bore down, a plate in each hand. "All right, can it." "What? I just asked about passports. What are you—" "It's a very cold night out tonight, ain't it?" Their plates were put before them, and the waiter went the way he had come. "What's the matter with you, anyway? Don't you know there's some things you just don't ask about like that? This is a public place." "Oh, I'm sorry," Otto said, and watched his companion cross himself and start to eat. "Are you Catholic?" he asked. The eyes turned full upon him, penetrating the dust. He swayed and looked down at his plate. "Am I a Catholic? What do you think I am?" "Oh, that's fine. I was just sort of surprised." 7 thin slices of mushroom stuck to the top of the meat. Magic number. Otto cut into them. Somewhere in exile, doubtless, the handsome young prince must be sitting over cognac so fine it could hardly be swallowed, recalling legends of the king. Otto put a piece of the dry meat into his mouth and could hardly swallow it. Beside him he smelled lavender and felt ill. He looked up to see the blonde Jean leave the bar, carrying her bag. She glanced at the two of them without recognition or interest. Otto raised his face, his eyebrows, and his fork to signal her. "You know her? You know that woman?" "No, I talked to her while I was waiting." "It's no time to get mixed up with women. Keep yourself out of trouble," he went on eating. "Yes, well, I guess it was just Christmas, you know. The sort of Christmas feeling." Otto raised another shred of meat on his fork. "I've thought of it, you know. Joining the church, was his answer through a mouthful of bread. It kind of gives a reason for things that otherwise don't seem to have any— it legitimizes, life, sort of." "You're either born into it or you're not." The fork beside him rested on the tablecloth. "There's too many people around joining it as if it was a sightseeing party." "But You got to be born into it." "In a sense, I was," said Otto, with a slight laugh of confidence, waiting affirmation. There was none. He rested his fork on the table. He felt dizzy. From the corner of his eye he saw the figure beside him bowed over the plate, eating fast, moving the food only a matter of inches from the plate to his mouth. A fly descended upon the bread and busied itself there. Otto's hand shook as he raised it with the fork. "I guess it's silly that I should be nervous now, but I am, I guess."
"Hide it the best way you can. It's all right to be nervous. Anybody gets nervous in a thing like this sometimes."
"But you don't need to show everybody you're nervous." "You look pretty young." "Young? Well, I guess I do look young, but I've been out of college for about 3 years now." "College? You went to college?" He wiped his mouth with his napkin, bowing his head to do so, and looked up. "Yes, I thought I went to Harvard," Otto said, and for the first time noticed the man's necktie. "Why, you have on a Porcellian tie." Otto stared at the silk pigs' heads. "Were you PC? I mean, I didn't even know you went to Harvard." "Me? At college? You know where I studied. Attica and Atlanta." "But that tie, it is the Porcellian tie, isn't it?" "Don't worry, kid. I know what I'm doing." The fly lit on Otto's hand, and he shook it away. His legs were crossed, and he commenced rubbing his ankle up and down against what he believed to be the center leg of the table. The man in gray was leaving the bar. As he watched him go, Otto's hand rose with slow optimism to his chest, and his wrist pressed the vacancy there. Who could prove a thing? If he rose abruptly, dumping the table over if necessary, to turn square upon the upholstered shoulders beside him and cry, "Do you believe this?" But then, who would pay the check? And the bar bill? There would certainly be no offer of a Christmas gift of money, which Otto must somehow manage to suggest. A gift which might pay for the drinks he had enjoyed with Jean, for having seen the frayed trouser cuffs when they walked to the table, he could hardly expect more. Suddenly, he imagined his hair furiously red, his skin dark, or eyes at a telltale slant. That would give the lie to this whole thing. But no, his nose was really quite like the one beside him, though Otto refused to recognize it as being absolutely so, derivative. Noses were, after all, noses, quite similar among Caucasians. The most gross insult might simply be to say, "I trust there hasn't been some mistake." Better than that, to get up quietly from the table, cross the room quickly to the gentleman in light gray flannel, who also had a nose, and shake hands with him. But even now the gentleman in light gray flannel was gone. All this time, the sling had bumped between them without rousing curiosity. Now he heard, "What are you wearing that sling for? You really got hurt?" "Well, in a way, I thought it was a faked. You haven't learned how to handle it yet. You act like you're keeping a live squirrel in it." "But The music was the Blue Danube Waltz. Otto rubbed his mustache with his fingertip and looked into a distant mirror where he could see Santa Claus's strategic entrance and stealthy approach to the door of the bar, where he was apprehended. The fork beside him clattered to the plate. "I'm done. I think I've had enough," Otto said, barely half finished with the meal. He lit a cigarette as the smell of lavender rose, heard a ringing in his ears from nowhere, wet his lips, and heard forced salivation. Might it not all be rehearsed again, but differently, he thought, seeing a thin man of average height and quiet manner seated at a table in the middle of the room, finishing his dinner with a brandy? Might Otto not have walked over and shaken his hand, and seated across from him, unsurprised, have listened to his intimacies with opera stars, artists, producers, over breast of guinea hen and wine? The man in the club tie rose, looked at them, locking them together in his glance, and left. It was too late. Procostes' bed was made. The only thing now was to get out of it the best way he could, which Otto did, more with weariness than pain. "It's kind of difficult to talk about money, but—" "I've got it right here for you. You want to take it now?" said the voice through a mouthful of bread. He was cleaning his fingernails with the tine of a salad fork.
Take what? 20s. 5 G's in the perfect 20s. 5 what? 5,000. Here, it's a thick packet.
He motioned with his elbow to his side pocket.
$5,000? Christ! Keep your voice down. But isn't that too much? I mean, even with Christmas. Listen, are you sure you're not drunk?
Why, no, I wouldn't give this stuff to you if you was drunk. You'd probably throw it all over town before the night's over. Lift it out of my pocket there.
Oh, I'll be very careful of it. Very careful of it,
Otto said, as he reached into the pocket and lifted the packet out, while the other sat silent and unconcerned, cleaning his nails with the tine of his salad fork. Otto wanted another glass of whiskey. He opened the packet and took out a 20.
Christ! Don't wave them around here, said the man beside him, and looked over the room quickly.
But no one was near to notice them, and when he looked back he seemed unable to resist taking the bill from Otto and laying it on the cloth before him.
Beautiful, he said. Beautiful, isn't it?
Yes, Otto gasped.
A real work of art.
He stared into the face of the 7th president.
You know it takes 6 different artists to make one of these? That's what makes it tough. 6 to 1. 6 against 1, you might say.
He turned it over and ran a fingertip gently over the portico of the White House.
A real work of art, he said. You don't learn that at Harvard.
Otto stared. He clutched the packet as though it were liable to be wrenched from him at any instant.
You know they burn around 6 tons of this stuff a day, the true quill, down in the Bureau of Printing and Engraving. Worn-out bills. It's a crime.
Yes, but, well, this was all Otto could say. The hand beside him rose to catch at a lapel as the man sat back and stared upward, relaxed in nostalgia.
Johnny the Ghent died the other day, he said. You know him?
No,
He melted down the Ascot Cup. He was the first one to gild the sixpence, and pass them as half-sovereigns until they had to call them in. He knew so much about the church that once he posed as Bishop of the Falkland Islands. He just died, Johnny. He had about $10 on him.
Otto appeared to listen, but he heard nothing but jarring syllables.
He organized the best den London ever saw. He was even a Sunday school teacher for 5 years. He was a great man. I've thought of him a lot of times when I was sitting in the hole.
The waiter approached a nearby table.
Put that stuff away.
Otto put the 20 into his pocket and the packet between his knees.
I miss him when a great artist dies like that. He was no bum. It's no place for bums to get into. But they're ruining it every day. There hardly is a single old master left, a real craftsman like Johnny or Jim the penman. And me. I haven't had a notice in the Detector in 14 years.
The what? Otto asked, politely but firm.
The National... Listen. Shut up and listen to that a minute. It is.
What?
Vissi d'arte, vissi d'amore, he murmured with the music. Non feci mai male ad anima viva.
And they sat silent to the violent, grief-impassioned end. When it was done, Otto said, "That was very nice."
Nice? Is that all you can say? But you're just a kid. You never heard Cavalieri du Tosca.
No,
I'm going to get out now. He stood and found his cane.
Well, but, don't you want some coffee or something?
No, I shouldn't have stayed this long anyhow.
Otto took the check. "I'll get this," he said graciously.
"All right, kid, thanks."
"But thank you, Merry Christmas." Otto was left, the packet clutched against his parts, sniffing the delicious aroma of lavender, only half aware that the table had 4 legs. A fly landed on his hand, and he simply stared at it. 2 men went out the revolving door, the second a figure in a checked suit who had been waiting for some time in the lobby. He caught the other by the arm.
"This is you, isn't it?" "What do you mean?"
"You're Frank. They told me I was going to meet you in the lobby. They kept me half an hour late, but you're an hour. Have you got the stuff? 5 G's in queer?"
"Jesus and Mary!"
"I'm the pusher they sent you, no? Have you got the queer?"
"Jesus, Mary, and Joseph!"
"What's the matter with you, for Christ's sake?"
"That kid, that fairy, he took every bit of it. He sat there, rubbing his ankle against my leg."
"Where'd he go? We'll go in and get him. He's got the queer on him?"
"We'll wait out here. We'll get him when he comes out."
"Where you going now?"
"Right here in this doorway."
The coat came off, was reversed, the black wig went into one pocket, green muffler and glasses into the other, and the sandy mustache appeared, stuck to his upper lip.
"It's cold," said Mr. Sinistera. "And stop calling it the queer."
Otto had appeared at the desk briefly to put down a $10 deposit on his bill. He was taken to a room. There he sat on the edge of the bed. He tore the wrapping from the money and started to count it. The sling got in his way. He ripped it off and threw it on the floor. Then he made piles of 10 bills each, fanned out alternating backs and faces on the bed cover. He stood looking at it, and then turned to the mirror and ran his fingertip over his mustache. He called downstairs and waited for the bellboy to come with a razor and anything else that might come in handy, passing the time counting the money in various positions. When the razor arrived, he shaved quickly and dressed. He reeled a little, putting 4 20s with his change, which included a 10, and the rest into a drawer hurriedly, for he heard stirring next door, remembering his neighbor. He turned off the light, closed his door, and stood outside 666, where he knocked, and, unable to restrain himself, and as surprised to find the door unlocked, threw it open.
"Who? What do you want?"
Jean cried, pulling a sheet to her throat, uncovering her neighbor, whose light gray flannel suit lay on the floor.
"Why, you... Why... Get out! Get out of here! What do you mean coming in a lady's room like that?"
The door banged.
Now, just who the devil was that?
"Don't worry, honey, it's only a fairy I met down in the bar."
A fairy?
"You know, queer. He said he was a writer, and they're always queer nowadays."
"There he goes," said the man in the checked suit. "Out the side door. Look out of the way, you dumb bastard."
"That's no way to talk to Santa Claus."
"Well, get out of our way."
"Merry Christmas. Have you got a dime for old St. Nick?"
"Get the next cab in the line and follow him." The 2 cabs pulled away from the curb half a minute apart, and a police car drew up before the hotel.
"I could sue you for false arrest," Mr. Pivner said when he got into the lobby with the policeman, "if that would do any good. Do you know what you've done?"
Behind him, the policeman talked with the tall bellboy, who said,
"Well, Jesus, I thought he was drunk. The guy with him was."
The policeman said, "We got him down to the station house and found a needle on him. We thought he was a junkie. He's real pissed off."
"Do you know what you've done? Did you see him? A boy with a scarf like this on. He came here to meet me. That was my son. My son."
The policeman turned to the revolving door, and the tall bellboy said to him,
"While you're at it, take Santa Claus along. He's driving us nuts out there."
The controversy in the sky by this time was no nearer settlement. There was really no promise of armistice at all, though the haggling might continue, precipitating fine rain for periods of monotonous variance, broken by impatient bursts of sleet. The skyline of the city was reduced to 2 dimensions. There was no depth. Accustomed to mass, and there was no such sensation, but instead buildings in immediate isolation, their heights a-whirl in the weather, their lights incredible in the night, their feet undiminished by comparison with the mass which had clung to their sides, pretending support, cowering now out of sight, would be there next day if it were fair, pretending and sharing the steep triumph of these hampered giants tonight abandoned in trial to their integrity. The first cab turned into Jones Street. The second waited at the corner.
"He's going into that doorway where all those cops are. What's he doing there?"
"How should I know what he's doing there? I never should have trusted him."
"I wouldn't trust a fairy."
"He's not a Catholic. I should have known."
They watched Otto talk with one of the policemen and get back into his cab.
"How do you ever do a thing like that?"
"It was pride. It was the deadly sin of pride. I was so proud of those... Oh, Mary, pray for me. If I hadn't been so proud, I would have watched my step."
"Let's just let him go," said the man in the checked suit as Otto's cab left the curb. "The hell with him."
"Let him go? With all that? You think it's worthless, that paper? You think it's a cheap job I did? Driver, follow that cab."
The jukebox played Return to Sorrento.
Someone said, "Have you read this? It's by a woman who spent the entire winter last year in Rome. She tells all about it here."
At hand, a limp wrist hung on air.
"I was in Florida for 2 fearfully rainy weeks, and I didn't get browned very much."
Laughter sprinkled up around him.
"I'm a drunkard,"
said one of the 2 men sitting at a table with Victoria and Albert Hall.
"Nothing but a drunkard," he repeated despondently.
"You think that's bad? I'm a drunk and I'm queer, too," said the other. "An alcoholic and a homosexual."
"So," demanded the paterfamilias, "I'm a drunk, a homosexual, and a Jew."
She looked them over calmly and finished her drink.
"I'm alcoholic, homosexual, and a Jew," she stated, "and I'm crippled."
When the next round of drinks arrived, she was the toast.
"Have you heard the one about the muscular fellow named Rex, who had minuscular organs of sex?"
"Do you know il y avait une jeune fille de Dijon?"
"Es gibt ein Arbeiter von Linz."
The whole gripping story is founded on fact. Look at the beautiful girl shown in the accompanying cut, Anselm read aloud. "Are you listening? Note the cruel marks cut in her tender body by the lash of the cat-o'-nine-tails wielded by the hands of a heartless and Christless Mother Superior in whose heart all human sympathy has been assassinated by the papal system." He lowered The Moan of the Tiber to look up at Stanley.
"You're still brooding over that thing?" he asked, seeing the torn strip of newspaper in Stanley's hand. "That's yesterday's paper. The whole of St. Mark's is probably under water by now. What are you drinking so much coffee for?"
"I have to stay awake when I get home to work,"
Stanley said, and looked anxiously at his wristwatch.
"To work?" Anselm muttered. "What are you waiting for?"
But he appeared to have no interest in what Stanley might answer or not. He sat slumped, looking sullenly out from the table at the evening victims of the Via Reggio. The spots on his face were dulled, his eyes lit with a smoldering rancor now and then as he watched them, but his tone was vague when a tall girl with dark hair, reaching her fur-piece, said to someone,
"Well, I have yet to see an animal reading a book,"
and Anselm mumbled, "How'd you like to get your hand in her muff?" Then he brought a hand up, fingers turned in upon the palm, and commenced to bite his nails. A minute later, he had slumped again motionless and started to whistle, dull and rasping through his teeth. Stanley looked up.
"What's that?" "What you're whistling?"
"Too much mustard."
"Too much what?" "No, what is it? It's familiar. It's Bach?"
"Yes, it's called I Can Give You Anything But Love," Anselm answered without looking up. "Bach wrote it when he was 3, he added, for Mother's Day."
"Anselm," Stanley said, inclining toward him slightly, "is something wrong?"
"Is something wrong?" Anselm turned at him. "That's the stupidest—"
But his voice trailed off. He lowered his eyes from Stanley and scratched his head.
If there's anything I could do?
Anselm looked at the blunt black ridges of his nails, then held them out. I've got psychosis, see? Not psychosis like these other crazy bastards. Plain SYCOSIS. Scabs. And he went back to scratching his head. Mr. Fettle entered, an alarm clock swinging from his neck on a piece of twine. In the doorway he bumped the man in the checked suit, whose companion said,
"Go in and get him."
"I couldn't just pull him out of there," said the man in the checked suit.
"He won't stay long. He's too jumpy to hang around a dump like this."
"Look out, there he goes!"
"Goes hell. He's a-going to the can."
As he stood occupied, the mirror was beside him at his left shoulder, and Otto stared into it. He continued to stare as he turned a minute later, buttoning his trousers, weaving slightly, and allowing the smile to come to his face slowly as though savoring the renewal of an acquaintance long away, dead perhaps for all they knew, in the jungles, returned now, and returned affluent. Then the smile left his face as slowly, and the same reckoned composure with which it had come. With all the sincerity of a suppliant before an icon, he said, "If I were a character in a play, would I be credible?" When the door banged open, he was standing looking down at the pale left hand extended from his sleeve and licking the strangely naked upper lip. "What are you grinning about? You look pretty pleased with yourself." "What? Oh," he spun around. "Max." "What happened? You sell your play or something?" "My play? Yes, that's it. How did you know? Yes." "Good," Max said over his shoulder. Smiling, he added, "Look, I hope you didn't think I had anything to do with what people were saying." "People?" Otto repeated vaguely, going toward the door. "You know, that you'd plagiarized—" Oh, that, yes, no, I wouldn't have thought that," Otto said, and left Max bound there to deepen the steaming gully and the cake of ice in the drain. He saw Stanley sitting at a table with Anselm, who was listlessly turning pages in a magazine which bore the picture of a girl sliding down a banister, and the challenge, "Can Freaks Make Love?" on the cover. Anselm tore something out and pushed it across the table to Stanley, who looked at it and then away quickly, his eyes searching the room for refuge until he lowered them to the floor. "Hey, Hannah! Look at those two," said a tall, round-headed young man in an expensive suit. "Did you ever see that Kollwitz print, Zwei Gefangene Musik hörend? That's what they look like, two prisoners listening to music." "Stanley is a sort of prisoner," Hannah said, half to herself. "Anybody is who's always broke." He handed her the beer he'd got her. "You can talk." Hannah turned on him, accepting the dripping glass. "You work for your money, so you don't have to worry spending it." He stared at her, then cleared his throat, and asked, "Say, is that really Ernest Hemingway behind me?" "What if it is? What would that make you?" I'd like to meet him. I think he's a great writer." "You think some of it will wipe off on you? You're still a salesman. Did you ever read Cummings' poem, 'A salesman is an it that stinks to please,' and you want to write?" "I do in my spare time. I've taken a course." "Go stink to please somewhere else." "Yes, All right." "All right." He turned $200 worth of tweed on her and said, "Mr. Hemingway, my name is George."
"Glad to see you, George," said the big, unshaven man. "What are we drinking?"
Otto paid for his whiskey and soda with a $20 bill and stood unsteadily looking about him. "What are you mumbling about?" Hannah demanded from just beneath the level of his gaze. He was looking at a tall blonde girl who had just said in Boston accents that Paris was like a mouthful of decayed teeth.
"Hannah, I just sold my play,"
Otto repeated, but aloud this time, as though finding confirmation in what he heard. "You sold your play?" Her query sustained him, but no further than, "Can you buy me a beer?" as she put an empty glass on a table behind her. He struggled to the bar, got her a glass, and handed it to her over someone's shoulder. But when he'd paid for it and turned again, she was gone, leaving only her query echoing Max's, sanctioning what he had heard in his own words, and ratified now with a murmured yes and a smile of discovery. But immediately he saw Max standing at the table with Anselm and Stanley, looking in his direction and talking through a smile. He felt unsteady again, called upon to defend himself, and his hand rose to the empty fall of his jacket as he approached them. Max always looked the same, always the same age, his hair always the same short length, in his smile the humorless agreeability of one who could neither suffer friendship nor celebrate enmity, a parody on the moment, as his clothes caricatured a past at Eastern colleges where he had never been.
"And if it's only through sin that we can know one another, and share our human frailty," Stanley went on, staring into his coffee, "and by doing that, we come to know ourselves."
"Crossing the Atlantic Ocean to get laid. He can't even get it up without a dose of methyl testosterone," Anselm interrupted, without looking up as Otto approached. Without a pause in his speaking, he tore something from his magazine and held it out to Otto, who read, "Lonely? 25 cents brings magazine containing pictures, descriptions of lonely, sincere members everywhere, seeking friendship, companionship, marriage." "What better reason is there to get out of this stupid white Protestant country, for Christ's sake?" "Yes, for Christ's sake. At least Catholic countries take sin as a part of human nature. They don't blow their guts when they find you've gone to bed with a woman. Somebody like him is scared to try it here. He'd rather go where nobody knows him, a bunch of stupid foreigners he doesn't have to respect because they don't speak English and don't have any money, where nobody will point at him in the streets if they see him coming out of a whorehouse. Christ. It breaks my heart. Somebody like that, it breaks my heart. But you know what breaks my heart?" He looked up directly at Otto, who started, the smile jarred from his face, whose eyes, evading a wince, found Max's indulgent smile. "That's sin," Anselm hissed, looking back at the tabletop. Christ." None of them spoke. Stanley clung to his coffee cup as though moored there. Otto tottered slightly. Max stood reflecting the vacant satisfaction he found in exposé.
"With all the rotten betrayals around us, and that one moment of trust is sin?" Anselm whispered, looking at none of them. None of them spoke until Anselm said, "You're spilling your goddamn drink. What's the matter with you?" And Otto, righting his glass and licking his naked upper lip, came round to the other side of the table and the empty chair Max stood beside, bumping a girl who was carrying "Everybody Can Play the Piano" under her arm, and saying, "Well, I thought his approach was rather crude, just coming at me like that with a dollar bill wrapped around it."
"You're not sitting here?"
Otto asked Max, who stepped aside with the courtesy accorded infirmity.
"Who's going abroad?"
Otto asked after a moment, seated. Stanley looked up at Anselm, as though to give him opportunity of answering, then said himself in a quelled tone,
"Don Bildow,"
sounding as though he wanted to say more, but could find no more to say. And Otto looked up over backs and shoulders to see Don Bildow's white face bobbing behind the plastic-rimmed glasses, and heard from someone falling toward the table, "Everything is either concave or convex." Someone caught and raised to receive this intelligence. "Nothing, absolutely nothing, can convince me that all of us and everything isn't shrinking at the rate of 1 millimeter a minute."
"Has anybody seen Esme?"
Otto asked, his voice in an abrupt strain. "I just went by her house," he added hurriedly, and brought his glass to his lips. "Nobody there?" Max asked behind him.
"Well, no, not really. I mean, no."
"Not even Chaby?"
"No, he wasn't there, no. I mean, I didn't see him. I didn't really go in. I just passed there," Otto finished,
looking up confused, rummaging his pale left hand, whose freedom no one had noticed, in a pocket, and seeing Stanley's ragged mustache licking a lip whose nakedness no one had remarked. "Would anybody like a drink?" he asked, and signaled a waiter who did not see him. Behind him, someone said, "1 million people try to disappear in America every year. 1 million Americans try to erase themselves. That's a statistic, and it doesn't include criminals either. 1 million a year. 1 million people a year." The jukebox played Return to Sorrento, and nearby someone said that St. Francis Xavier was only 4.5 feet tall. Does drunkenness threaten your happiness or your loved ones? Our remarkable new discovery quickly and easily helps bring relief from all desire for liquor. No willpower is necessary to stop drinking. This is strictly a home method, Anselm read, returning to his magazine and his dull tone. "I'd just like some coffee," Stanley said. "Have you got some money?" Anselm asked. "If you do, I'd rather eat." And he called a waiter. "Yes, as a matter of fact, I just sold my play," Otto said to them. He looked quickly from Anselm's shrug to the first sign of Stanley's approving pleasure, but could not stop his eyes, and turned to Max for confirmation. "Eggplant parmigiana," Anselm ordered behind him, and Otto caught the waiter's arm as he departed to order another whiskey and coffee for Stanley, who looked up at that moment to ask, "Didn't you go to see Esme earlier?" "Well, yes, earlier. I saw her earlier." The confusion in Otto's voice was reflected in his eyes. Escaping Stanley's simple question, he looked round at hazard for a new topic, and unfortunately found it immediately. "There's Hannah," he said. "I just saw Hannah. The waiter appeared with their orders. Anselm was laughing. "But I don't see why someone said what they said about me, about Hannah and me," Stanley brought out. And Otto, fleeing the appeal on this side and the laughter on the other, looked to Max, whose smile was the conspiracy of an instant, an embrace confirmed in Stanley's discerning and quickly lowered eyes. "Stanley, you don't think—" "I didn't mean—" Otto commenced, the lines of his face rising toward his brow in anxious entreaty, when Anselm interrupted, growling with his mouth full, and Otto turned to him for deliverance. Anselm ate rapidly, jamming pieces of bread into his mouth between forkfuls of the eggplant, as though he expected it all to be taken away at any moment. Still he managed to growl at Stanley, and crumbs flew from his mouth across the table. "The beast," Anselm gurgled, chewing. "The beast in the jungle. The beast with 2 backs," he growled and snarled and laughed at once. "Stalking, crouching, ready to spring. That's the number of the beast that's stalking you, the beast that's waiting to devour you, the beast with 2 backs, waiting to spring." And he lunged, blowing breadcrumbs. "Look, Anselm," Otto's voice quavered toward firmness. But Anselm already appeared to have relented. He sat chuckling over his almost empty plate, looking down as though some imminent satisfaction filled his mind, while under the table, out of their sights, his hands opened a small flat tin, took out an envelope, and unrolled its contents. Meanwhile, the waiter stood there with the bill, and Otto seized the interruption, taking a roll of money from his pocket. "Here, I'll get this," he said, as though it were necessary to forestall them, though neither moved until Anselm shot an arm forth unseen and dropped something into Stanley's coffee. And as Otto sat back folding his money, Anselm asked him agreeably, "Could you lend me something?" Why, yes, sure," Otto said. "How much?" "Whatever you can." "Yes," Otto repeated, hesitated, and turned to Stanley. "Do you need any right now, Stanley? Any money? Because I'd be glad to lend you some." "Maybe $5, Stanley said. "I might need it, if I go to the dentist. I have a tooth—" "Here, take this," Otto said, unfolding the bills again, and he held out a 20. "Go ahead. You might need it." "No, just $5. That's all I'd need, just $5. "Give him 5, I'll take the 20, Anselm said quickly, putting a hand out. "You know the kind of a lousy life I have. I need it." But he watched Otto hand the clean $20 bill to Stanley over another faint gasp of protest, and accepted himself a worn 5, murmuring, "Thanks, Thanks, and have you got a cigarette?" Having trouble even then getting one from the pack with his blunt, bitten finger ends. "I didn't know you smoked," Otto said to him. "I do sometimes," Anselm said, holding the cigarette unfamiliarly, and then he folded the $5 bill smaller and smaller until it was a wad scarcely the width of his tortured thumbnail. He puffed the cigarette once or twice, then dropped it on the floor and stepped on it, and in that minute all of the sullenness of a little while before had returned, and he stared at the table as though he were sitting there alone. Max had turned away to talk with a small elderly man dressed in black, with black rubbers and a black hat, carrying a black umbrella. He appeared to say nothing, nodded his head occasionally, and accepted the drink Max brought him, while Max talked. Max returned to identify the black figure as the art critic for Old Masses, said he had a very incisive wit, and had given his pictures very good notices. "Which is what makes all the difference," Max added, smiling. "It's strange having the use of this left arm again," Otto said finally. "Oh, yes, you were wearing a sling, weren't you?" Stanley said, looking up quickly at the hand motionless on the table. "It looks very white," he commented. "Did it leave a bad scar?" "Why don't you ask him to show you the scar?" Anselm demanded. "I'll bet it was a nice hole. You envy him, for Christ's sake." "It isn't the wound that matters so much, getting it," Stanley said, as Otto sat back and lowered the pale hand to his lap. "But the scar is a witness for all the wounds we get. All the wounds. All kinds of wounds. I heard about somebody once who had a scar, and he bandaged it every once in a while to renew the wound." "Scars. All Stanley wants is scars to show people. Scars! Hey, Stanley, did you hear about the reliquary they opened that was supposed to have Ignatius Loyola's left arm in it? They brought it over on a boat. When they opened it, they found an arm with a heart tattooed on it, with a bleeding dagger and the word Mother. Ha! 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 "That's not true," Stanley said promptly. "And it's not wanting to suffer just for that, just to suffer. It's more proving the right to suffering." "Come off it, man," said a haggard face rising over the back of a booth. "You're dragging us." "He's right, for Christ's sake. Everybody suffers. The crime is in this world you suffer, and it doesn't mean a goddamned thing. It doesn't fit anywhere. You can stand any suffering if it means something," Anselm went on rapidly, but still as though suppressing some specific thing which filled his mind. "The only time suffering's unbearable is when it's meaningless," he finished, muttering. At that, Otto raised an eyebrow and licked his lip, preparing to quote the lines with which Gordon reduced Priscilla toward the close of Act 2, the scene in the doorway of the summer cottage, which glittered before him even now, as though in production. "Gordon, suffering, my dear Priscilla, is a petty luxury of mediocre people. You will find happiness a far more noble and infinitely more refined—" "You remember what Montherlant has to say?" Max interrupted them. "Le bonheur est un état bien plus noble et bien plus raffiné que la souffrance." His French was unprofessional and surprisingly clear. Otto muttered impatiently at being interrupted the moment he had started to speak, and turned to ask Stanley if he had ever read any Weininger, as Max finished, "Le petit luxe des personnes de médiocre qualité." "That's a lot of crap," Anselm said without looking up. "When he says that life must be led in the dark," Otto pursued, "and that we must assume postulates to be true, which, if they were true, would justify—" "Hey, Stanley, I've got a song for you." "Leave him alone." "Hannah, Sit down in Otto's place. He's delivering a lecture on Die Philosophie des Als Ob, Anselm advised her. On what? Otto demanded curtly. The buttons say U.S., so they just mean us, I guess, Anselm sang, tearing something from his magazine, which he handed to Hannah. So they must just stand for me and Mother.
Get male hormones. Science has discovered that domestic and business worries often disappear when male hormone deficiency is overcome. If you do not feel the return of that old-time activity, that keen love and zestful desire for life—
Shut up and leave him alone, Hannah repeated, crumpling the paper, but she did not drop it. Leave who alone? Otto and I are discussing Weichinger, aren't we, Otto? He's an expert on Als Ob. Ich gebe Ihnen mein Wort, Hannah, an expert. Ich bin ihm nicht gewachsen, Hannah. Shut up, she said to him, looking him straight in the face as he became more agitated. The spots on his complexion stood out vividly, and his hair was up as though a wind were blowing. He reached up and felt it, took out a dirty pocket comb, and made cracking sounds combing his hair. Scabs, he said. I'm psychotic. Do you know who I envy? I envy Tourette. He had a disease named after him, a very goddamned rare one.
Are you drunk? If you're not, why don't you shut up?
When you have Tourette's disease, you go around repeating dirty words all the time. Coprolalia! Everybody below 14th Street has coprolalia. Then he opened his magazine and turned suddenly to Otto. Women are funny, he read. You never know whether you're making the right move or not. Avoid disappointment, heartbreak, save yourself lots of tragedy. Don't be a faux pas.
Anselm, Otto began quietly, why don't you relax and—
You're drunk. Why don't you try God? 4 3-letter words. Why not try God? That's a book by Mary Pickford. Real coprolalia. You'd like that. Then he got breath and said, You know who I envy? Never mind. The buttons say U.S.
What's the matter with you tonight? Is it on account of Charles?
Hannah cut in, and Anselm stopped singing abruptly and stared at her. I'm not singing to you, he said after a moment, faltering, and he looked down at the dirty floor, muttering something.
Well, why don't you—
Well, why don't you leave us alone? You— God damn you— You—
I meant to tell you how glad I am about your play, Stanley said to Otto. I am, honestly.
Thank you, I know you are, Otto said, and put a hand to his shoulder.
You're really good, aren't you, Stanley? I wish I were. I wish everyone was.
There'd be a lot of crazy priests out of work. Work. Ha, ha, ha. Anselm, you— Damn you, Hannah. God damn you. Is it any business of yours if I feel this way about Charles? And his mother coming here to get him and take him home to Grand Rapids, and when he wouldn't go, she left him here with nothing? With his wrists just like she found him, You remind me of her. Maybe it's your goddamn smile. Maybe it's the way you try to get your hooks into Stanley, for his own good! For his own good!
But what?
It's the complacency I can't stand, Anselm burst out. I can't stand it anywhere, but most of all I can't stand it in religion. Did you see Charles's mother? Did you see her smile? That holier-than-thou Christian Science smile, she turns it on like— They're so complacent about this error of matter they've picked up. It's nice because it's mine, that's the kind of look they have, as if the old bag who started them off was the first one to think of the error of matter. Didn't they ever hear of Catharism? Or the Albigensians? Or the Manichaeans? Or even Bishop Berkeley? No. They stop thinking the minute they get hold of that thing, science and health. They never read another book after that. They've got a corner on the truth. Everybody else is a goy.
So what have you got your balls in an uproar for? Hannah pressed him.
Because Charles and I don't blame Charles a goddamn bit for flipping. God is love. We'd all flip. Taking that from your own mother, and you're lying there with your wrists slashed open. But love on this earth? Christ! Pity? Compassion?
That's why I've got my balls in an uproar, if you want to know, talking about some kind of love floating around Christ knows where. But what did she give him? When he wouldn't go back to Grand fucking Rapids and be treated by Christian Science, she gave him one of those eternally damned holier-than-thou smiles and left him there. She left him here without a cent to let Bellevue kill him, or let him try it again himself. God is love, for Christ's sake. If Peter had smiled like a Christian Scientist, Christ would have kicked his teeth down his throat. He sat there whispering to himself, and then said, "At least the Catholics have some idea of humility, I have to admit."
"All right, Anselm. Nobody—"
All right, I'll shut up. But don't you understand me?"
He half rose from the table, looking at her with an insane intensity, and then, shuddering through his frame, sank back in his chair, and she turned to Stanley.
"How is your mother?" she asked him. "You always ask me that, Hannah." "Thank you for asking. But how is she?" "She's waiting. She's still waiting very patiently. They're going to move her to another hospital."
"Catch my mother waiting patiently," Anselm muttered.
"Please don't talk disrespectfully of your mother, Anselm."
"She's a nut, Stanley," said Anselm calmly, looking up at him. "It's all right. I'm just stating a fact. She's a nut. An old nut. Right now she's probably down in the tombs forcing a Bible on some poor bastard who just wants to be left alone with... Alone." He was perspiring, staring at the dirty floor.
"Do you care if he... a saint kissing the leper's sores?" he whispered to none of them,
and then said, Never mind, you can't... Do you know who I envy?"
Mr. Feddle's alarm clock swung like a pendulum as he almost fell, recovered, and tipped in the opposite direction. The swinging clock banged the edge of their table. "That old fool," Otto muttered, "except he's not funny."
"But very sad,"
Stanley said, drawing back as the clock swung in a dangerous arc above the tabletop and down. Someone cried, "Ow!" as it cracked an ankle.
"He's happy now because he's publishing something at last. People congratulate him. They're really laughing at him all the time because it's a vanity house, but he doesn't know that they're laughing at him. And his wife looks troubled and says, 'But publishing is expensive, isn't it?' She doesn't know you're supposed to make money publishing something. She thinks any author has to pay to publish something of his own. At parties, he used to go around autographing books from the bookshelves. He'd write a dedication and sign the author's name."
"That's good," Otto laughed, looking at Mr. Feddle's back, which stood now stolid as a grandfather clock, only the pendulum swinging, for he had just bowed and shaken hands. "It could go in a play."
"You shouldn't be cruel now, just when you've sold your play, Otto."
"But even if I hadn't," Otto turned on Stanley, "even if I hadn't." "I envy Dr. Hodgkin." Anselm was cleaning his teeth thoughtfully with a folded match cover. "He had a disease named after him."
"What kind of disease?"
"Hodgkin's disease, for Christ's sake."
"A kind of cancer," said Max from behind them.
"Cancer, hell, it's a kind of leukemia. If you want to know what it is, it's progressive hyperplasia of the lymphatic glands associated with anemia. Lymphadenoma." "Where'd you hear that?" "I studied medicine," Anselm said, mumbling, as he did usually when admitting to something favorable about himself, and, as immediately embarrassed at so having drawn their attention, tore from his magazine Piles. Amazingly fast palliative relief. No mess or sticky fingers. It's better, faster, easier to use. Beneath that, God wants you. Poor health, money troubles, a remarkable new way of prayer that is helping thousands to glorious new happiness and joys. "Here, Stanley, take your choice. It's all one anyhow," he said, rolling the cover closed on Can Freaks Make Love. "You know, the trouble with you
"You're all Mother's sons," Max said to them. Stanley stopped stirring his coffee and looked up. Anselm turned on him. Hannah had turned away. "You and Anselm and Charles," Max smiled agreeably to Stanley. "And Otto?" he added, looking at Otto, who said, "As a matter of fact, I just finished dinner with my father a little while ago." "Otto's part of a series of an original that never existed," Max said, as though he had not heard. "What do you mean? You—" "That's what you told me yourself yesterday, didn't you?" Max drew him on. "But, no." Otto rubbed his hand over his eyes. "The series didn't exist, but the original existed. The original did. It had to." He sat there looking glazed-eyed for a moment, then turned to Stanley. "I just had dinner with my father," he said, as though remembering back over a great distance, or attempting to separate a distant image from one which had recently supplanted it. "For the first time," he added. "Did you like him?" Stanley asked uncertainly. "It's a funny feeling. It was strange, sort of. I feel like I'd lost something, I feel like nobody sort of—" Staring straight ahead of him, he rubbed his forehead and his wrist, descending, paused to press against his ribs, where no identity interrupted his contagion with himself. "I don't know," he mumbled, licking his naked lip, and went on in a low tone to Stanley. "Look, if you had a friend, somebody you haven't seen for a long time, and someone else takes his place, but he still— I don't know. Never mind." "You're drunk," Anselm offered. "That's funny," Otto persisted, without looking up at Max. "To say the original never existed. Look," he went on to Stanley, "suppose you knew somebody who used to be a friend and you found out he was, well, like Mr. Fettle, putting names on things that weren't his. I mean—" "You know who I envy," Anselm broke in on them impatiently. "I envy Christ. He had a disease named after him. Ha ha ha! Hey, Stanley?" Stanley pretended not to hear. He looked up from his cold coffee and said to Otto, "But if Mr. Fettle saw a copy of a play by Ibsen, if he loves The Wild Duck and wishes he had written it, he wants to be Ibsen for just that moment and dedicate his play to someone who's been kind to him. Is that lying? It isn't as bad as people doing work they have no respect for at all. Everybody has that feeling when they look at a work of art and it's right, that sudden familiarity, a sort of recognition, as though they were creating it themselves, as though it were being created through them while they look at it or listen to it, and it shouldn't be sinful to want to have created beauty." "Why don't you go home and read St. Anselm before you talk like this?" said Anselm, sitting forward, opening his eyes, which he had closed as though attempting sleep here. "The picture, before it is made, is contained in the artificer's art itself," he said, "and any such thing, existing in the art of an artificer, is nothing but a part of his understanding itself."
"St. Anselm, dig him," said the haggard face, bobbing over the back of the booth. "What are you trying to prove?"
"I'm proving the existence of God, God damn you. St. Augustine says a man who is going to make a box has it first in his art. The box he makes isn't life, but the one that exists in his art is life. For the artificer's soul lives, in which all these things are before they are produced."
"Where's God in the box?"
"You dumb son of a bitch."
"What's your favorite song, Anselm?"
"Nola. Now screw, will you?"
"I wish I had written The Wild Duck," Stanley said.
"I'm high, man."
"On what?"
"On tea. We've been bawling all night. Have you got any? Hey, St. Anselm, have you got any charge?"
The haggard face hung over the back of the booth like a separate floating entity, rolling the eyes toward Max to say,
He's in training to be a saint.
I notice he doesn't eat meat. Is that the reason, Anselm? Max asked. So that your body won't—
What goddamn business is it of yours?
Save the bones for Henry Jones, gurgled the haggard face.
Anselm, preaching leftovers of the bleak ruin of Judaism, Max commenced with sententious ease. A watered-down humanism.
'Cause Henry don't eat no meat. Hey, Anselm, I got something for you.
What are you supposed to know about religion? Anselm turned on Max. As Fraser says, Max explained indulgently, the whole history of religion is a continuous attempt to reconcile old custom with new reason, to find sound theory for absurd practices. And what does St. Augustine mean when he talks about the devil perverting the truth and imitating the sacraments? This sacrament will go the way of all the rest of them, Max smiled. It won't be long before they're sacrificing Christ to God as God's immortal enemy.
Hey, Anselm, listen to this. Daddy-o Noster. Daddy-o up in thy way out pad. You are the coolest, and we dig you like too much.
The God killed, eaten, and resurrected is the oldest fixture in religion, Max went on suavely. Finally sacrificed in the form of some sacred animal, which is the embodiment of the God. Finally, everyone forgets, and the only sense they can make out of the sacrament is that they must be sacrificing the animal to the God, because that particular animal is the God's crucial enemy, responsible for the God's death. Crucial, Anselm spat out.
Thy joint be right, the squares be swung, the haggard face continued, reading from a scrap of paper.
And what does Justin Martyr mean when he says the evil spirits practice mimicry? Anselm demanded. Crucial.
Help us to score for some scoff today, and don't jump us salty if we come on like a drag, 'cause like we don't put down other cats when they goof.
The haggard face went on in the silence straining between Anselm and Max.
For thine is the horse, the hash, and the junk.
God damn you, give me that goddamned thing! Anselm burst out, swinging round and tearing the paper from the loose fingers, and the haggard face dropped out of sight to bob up once more with,
"'Cause, face it,"
and disappear again as Anselm tore the shred of paper into smaller and smaller bits. Look, Anselm, Max said, coming up to him. Why don't you be reasonable? You'll end up like Charles, this pose of yours.
Like Charles? And you, what, be reasonable?
Anselm got to his feet.
This pose, this Gottrunkener Mensch? Yes, you be reasonable. That's what they called Spinoza, your prince of rationalists, damn him. You know what they offered Spinoza to conform? 1,000 florins. Conform outwardly, they told him. But what did he do? He changed his name from Baruch to Benedictus, the prince of rationalists.
Max had taken a step back, and another, smiling as though embarrassed for Anselm, as Anselm came on.
And what did they do? They damned him, the lens-maker Spinoza. They excommunicated him right into the darkness of reason. The Shamatha. They damned him in the name that contains 42 letters. They damned him in the name of the Lord of Hosts, and the Tetragrammaton, in the name of the globes and the wheels and the mysterious beasts.
Max was backing toward the door, toward the man in the checked suit, who said,
"To tell the truth, I wouldn't dare go in there. They're all nuts."
"I'm freezing to death," said his companion. "In the name of Prince Michael and the ministering angels. Metateron, Achthariel Jah, the Seraphim, the Ophanim." Anselm went on shrilly as Max backed out into the night. "The trumpets dropped. They reversed the candles. Amen. There's the Shamatha, damned right into the darkness of reason." And he stood quivering in the empty doorway for a minute, indifferent to the eyes turned on him. Then he spat in the street and came back to the table where Otto had just stood preparing to leave. "Here, take this," Anselm said to him, holding out his magazine.
There's a special article in it, Can Freaks Make Love, with illustrations. A rare photo of Chang and Eng, the original Siamese twins, with two of their natural children.
He slumped in his chair again,
and after a moment started to whistle, rasping through his teeth.
"What is that? What you're whistling? It's Bach, isn't it?"
He looked up at Stanley, and after a moment, "Yes," he admitted. "The 78th cantata." His elbow rested on the moan of the Tiber.
"An aria?"
Stanley asked to his empty face. "We hasten with feeble but diligent footsteps. A duet," Anselm said vaguely, watching Stanley stir the cold coffee with a lifeless chill in his eyes. "Sung by women's voices." Stanley gasped, lifting the spoon from the coffee cup.
"What is it?"
he whispered, as the thing slipped back into the coffee. He raised it out again. "Ha, ha, 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 ha!" The alarm clock, strung to Mr. Feddle's neck, went off.
"What is it? It's,
He held it in the air, unable to move, staring at it. "You can use it for a bookmark, Stanley, for when you read Malthus." "Ha, ha, 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 ha! Look at what Stanley found in his coffee!"
"Anselm, did you—"
"Ha, ha, 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 ha!" Mr. Feddle shut the clock off with one hand, finished his beer with the other, bowed to three people, stumbling away from the hollow, desperate laughter behind him, out the door, where he bumped the man in the checked suit, who said, There he goes, out the other door, the side door."
Above emptied streets, the roseate heaving persisted. Above bodies contorted with sleep, strewn among the battlements erected in this common war without end, some wrenched as though in the last embrace, spoke with tongues, untended and unattended, extended limbs and members, to come up against the thigh of another fallen, and be similarly still, or rise distended to enter the warm nest again, and swim in the dark channel, committing the final assault in the anonymity of exhaustion, hearts emptied of prayer. But the bloodluster of the sky witnessed that the battle was not done, though all were slain. It shone like the sky over the Campagna, where Attila's Huns met the Romans in engagement so fierce that all were slain indeed, extreme but inconclusive, for their spirits continued the battle 3 nights and days over the field of unburied dead. In the bar of a midtown hotel, where the rear guard bivouacked among chrome and glass, scarred, alert at battle stations, for there's no discharge in the war, Otto rested his left arm openly before him, raised one eyebrow, turned his lips down at the corners, flared his nostrils, and paid with a $20 bill. He spilled his drink. "Better give me another," he said. "Irish."
"You've had enough, Jack."
"Will you give me another drink?"
"You've had enough tonight. Go home and sleep it off."
"Have I had enough?" "May I buy you a drink, madam?"
"Come on, Jack, don't start any trouble. Leave the lady alone."
"I'm talking to her, not to you."
"Come on, fellow, be a sport. Get the hell out of here." The man in the checked suit came in the street door as Otto, clutching Can Freaks Make Love, rolled in his right hand, strode from the bar into the lobby of the hotel.
"You want to buy some pictures?"
"Pictures?" Otto asked, turning.
"Girls, you know."
"Just girls?"
"Yeah, what's the matter, you queer?"
He started to thrust back into the envelope the pictures he had half displayed, tangles of white limbs. "Don't I know you?" Otto stared at the young man, the hat on the back of his head, the extinguished cigarette stub in the corner of his mouth.
"You don't know me, Mac," the young man said quickly. "You don't know me. You want these or not?"
"Let's see them."
"What's the matter? You don't trust me? I can't bring them out here. $1 for the pack."
"All right, here. Otto handed him a $1 bill. In the men's room, he opened the envelope. A sailor banged the door coming in, and Otto went into a booth. He stared at the first picture, and then sat down staring at it. He turned it up, and looked at each one, his fingers quivering against their glossy surfaces, at each one quickly ascertaining the face, unable to contain the whole figure in his apprehension, seizing at details, the unfamiliar maple chair she sat on, curled in, the Venetian blinds, the wallpaper, the upholstery pattern on the chair, her fingernails, the lines of her knuckles, the irregular dent of her navel, and the 2 full blots swelling toward him, detailed blemishes on the expanse of her flesh, which delineated it but could not bring it to life in any variety of pose and exposure, obstacles at which his gaze stumbled, passing over the shadowed white in a silent mania of search, which led him helplessly to her face and deserted him there, fixed by the mouth which stigmatized his hunger, fixed by the eyes which knew him and did not move. Aware of silence, he stared at these blemished rubrics. Warning, all so-called prophylactic tubes, not Sanatu, genuine, on the metal door before him, conscious only, now the sounds of it ceased, that the sailor had been sick in a wash-basin.
"Hey, come on out, you want a good browning?"
He sat, paralyzed by silence, suddenly cold and in detailed motion, shivering. The metal door before him banged and rattled on the latch.
"Hey, come out of there! What are you doing in there, pounding your pork?"
Another door banged.
"Okay, sailor, be a sport. Get the hell out of here."
He heard that, and heard the scuff of shoes on the tile floor, and listening, heard nothing. Out in the street he paused as 2 men came toward him from one direction, a woman from the other. She walked slowly, looking at him in apparently careless interest, a look of appraisal.
"Pardon me," he said. She stopped. Are you...
"Trying to make a pick-up?" she asked him.
"Yes, maybe, but it isn't that bad. It isn't that crude. It isn't just for that. It's that maybe you can... that I need..."
The man in the checked suit stopped, stayed by Mr. Sinistera's hand. Otto stopped swaying, stayed by the woman's hand on his wrist. "Come along with me," she said. He started to withdraw his hand, to take her arm, and he felt his wrist caught in a chain.
"But what's this? I mean you—"
She gave the nippers a slight twist and repeated, "Come along with me."
"I knew it," said Mr. Sinistera, standing behind a refuse can.
"A cop?"
"It sticks out all over her."
"It sure does. She's got a front like a cash register. We're screwed. If he has any of the queer on him, we're really screwed. What are you going to do?"
"Be quiet."
"Where you going?"
"I'm going to church."
"What the hell are you going to church for?"
"To confess."
"To confess this? To tell them—" "Why, geez, what's the matter with you? Them priests have a pipeline right into the cops."
"Be quiet. You think I'm a half-wit? I'm going to confess a sin."
"What sin, for Christ's sake?"
"Pride," said Mr. Sinistera, removing the mustache from his lip and putting it into his pocket. "And to burn a candle."
"For who you're going to burn a candle?" said the man in the checked suit, stepping back to look at his companion, his simple face falling into one of the few expressions it afforded, complete bafflement.
"For Johnny the Gent," said Mr. Sinistera, walking on. "He had humility."
The music was The Sorcerer's Apprentice, threading into the lobby as though seeking a listener, for the bar was empty. It came forth as though lunging from a coil hidden beyond the portieres, trailing and lunging as though these notes reaching the lobby now had been audible in the bar moments before. And sitting in the bar one might have followed the single course of the thing from behind, to behold it rearing over its prey. Then it struck. Mr. Pivner stirred, started, woke in alarm, to recover all that he could in this unfamiliar chair, his newspaper, which had slipped to the floor as he read, "Zoo escapes increase. Hunt madman." Police believe that they are on the trail of the man apparently insane who broke into the birdhouse at Central Park Zoo last week in an attempt to turn loose the specimens on display there. Theft was discounted as the motive. The lunatic, described as a tall Negro of uncertain age, was seen by Bertha Hebel, a cleaning woman, as she passed.
"I beg your pardon, sir. The young gentleman who you were waiting for has not come in yet. It is getting quite late, and I must get home. But I want to write a note," said Mr. Pivner, standing. He went to the desk, and the music lurked as he wrote. Then he put on his hat, which he had been carrying, and turned toward the revolving door, which the manager set in motion, and said, "Good night," as the music towered in ambuscade's tense imitation of silence. Sticking from an ash can halfway down the block, he saw a cane. He looked about him quickly to establish his loneliness in fact. And when the 4 notes struck in finale, he was beyond reach, moving slowly, escaping again in unconscious defiance of something which he did not understand, affirming with each step an existence still less comprehended, so crowded were its details, so clamorous of worth, until heeded, and then speechless as the night itself. Chapter 6. Des gens passants, on a des yeux, on les voit. The sky was perfectly clear. It was a rare, explicit clarity to sanction revelation. People looked up. Finding nothing, they rescued their senses from exile and looked down again. Behind the bars which kept children out of their cages, the 2 polar bears moved continuously without touching each other, the male in an endless circuit, down to the front where he half-reared, dropped, and returned to his mate, who stood swinging her head back and forth, timekeeper for their incarceration, clocking it out with this massive furred pendulum. "He's doing that every time I come here, swinging his neck," a little girl complained, straining at the outside bars. A little boy asked, "What's their names?" The female turned toward the rock cave, exposing the people to the filth of her unformulated rear. A young Negro stood and stared. A fat man in a yellow and brown necktie aimed his light meter and stepped back to adjust an expensive camera. "You thought I'd gone to Lapland, didn't you?" "My dear fellow, I hadn't the faintest notion where you'd gone," Basil Valentine said without turning from the bear's cage. His voice sounded strained and a little weary. He was wearing a double-breasted gray coat, slightly fitted, fully buttoned, a gray hat with a rolled brim, gray gloves, and his tie was striped black and dark red. The polar bear approached, looking him over, reared at the bars, sex apparent, wobbling among fur drawn into spines by the water, and retired, gone green up about the neck. "But you do look rather better this morning," Valentine added, as though needing the makeshift of this observation to turn around and look. "Where have you been?" "I? In a Turkish bath. Good God, but it's cold." "If you would put on an overcoat when you come out—" "What difference would that make? It would still be cold, wouldn't it?" "You know," Valentine went on, as they came out of the arcade, "when I look down to your feet, I'm almost surprised to see them there on the ground. I half expect empty trouser cuffs blowing in the wind." "Yes, I hate the cold. Shall we go down and buy you an overcoat?" "To see you hunched up with your hands in your pockets." "An overcoat? No, but listen, there's something. I went to the bank this morning for some money. I went to get some money out, and they told me there's only a few $100. Why, there should be... Basil Valentine pursed his lips, not as though coming forth to the subject at hand, but shifting from one preoccupation to another. "You've never known what sort of hand Brown kept on that account, have you?" "Why, no, He put money in and I took it out." "And you haven't seen him recently?"
Since the spree you went on?"
"I interrupted his murder, but there, I'd just escaped my own."
"What do you mean?" Valentine asked impatiently.
"Never mind. I won't try to explain it. Situations are fragile."
"Come now, what happened?" Basil Valentine demanded, walking on with his head lowered as they approached steps leading down. He spoke no more loudly than he might have done asserting some demand upon himself, and as impatiently knowing the question, but finding it necessary to hear it in words, as though the answer, cogent as the query, were bound to follow upon it. "And enough of this foolishness," he added.
No, I'm not joking. Who can tell what happened? Why, we have movement and surprise and recognition, over and over again, but who knows what happened? What happened when Carnot was stabbed? Why, the fellow climbed into the carriage and stuck a knife in his belly, and no one would ever have known it if he hadn't stopped to shout, "Vive l'anarchie!" All of our situations are so fragile, you see. If I meet you by surprise in a doorway, or come by invitation for cocktails, or by carefully prearranged accident, even that, no matter, you'll see, they're extremely fragile, and all this...
A hand was waved before Basil Valentine, where he paused to take off his gloves at the top of the steps. All this had been going on for some minutes, and Valentine was obviously annoyed. Indeed, he did know of the anarchist Casario's absurd blunder after assassinating the President of France half a century ago, an image which assailed him now with all the vivid insistence of those irrelevant details which crowd a memory being probed for some calamity so alarming or so disgraceful that memory does not want to surrender it to consciousness until leavened by time, when the enormity of the deed may be appreciated at a distance, and from this distance dismissed. Basil Valentine got his gloves off and stood looking at his hands for a moment, there at the top of the steps, as though recovering what the gloves had concealed, and verifying the left hand folded over the right with the glitter of the gold seal ring in the sun. Then, with the grey gloves clasped behind him, he descended.
"Did you see the moon last night?"
"I can't say I noticed it," Valentine answered, looking quite old, though in profile his face maintained its look of strength, even heightened now by the severe preoccupation which his voice reflected.
"Yes, in its last quarter, the horned moon."
They had walked down near the seal pool in the center, where a child of about 18 months stood blocking their way, gazing up at Basil Valentine, who paused again to take out a package of Virginia cigarettes. The child was hatless, wet-nosed, and dripping steadily from the breech.
Here, Valentine burst out, looking up. "I shouldn't touch it if I were you."
He offered a distracting cigarette.
"Touch her? But she's lovely. And the rose?"
"You never know what they may have in their hair, and I shouldn't like to think where she got the flower."
"It's ruined. Let her eat it. And come away."
Valentine turned without looking back at the dripping figure, twisted to watch his retreat, chewing rose-petal. His effort to appear agreeable was being riddled by these thrusts, and he heard now, beside him,
"Did you ever read the Grimm brothers? The Froschkönig? No, never mind. Listen, those fragments, you have them? You still have them safe?"
He stopped to light their cigarettes. "I haven't forgiven you for running off with that cigarette case, you know. Where is it?"
"I didn't ask you—" That? Why, it's probably in Ethiopia by now. The 3 Indies. And the bull, well, damn it. I brought you back a griffin's egg, a much scarcer commodity. I found it in a secluded shrine in—
"You haven't yet told me where you've been." Hunched over his cigarette, Basil Valentine looked through its smoke without taking it from his lips, and they stood there motionless as plants, Valentine in epinastic curve, as the expression on his face unfolded to immediacy, and bent him down over the growth from the lower surfaces before him. "You still hope to expose these fakes, then, do you?" he said calmly. The stem before him was uprooted.
"That's why I came back.
Back?" Valentine straightened up. "You went home, did you?" he said, and seemed to appreciate the confusion this remark brought to the downcast face beside him as they walked on. It was at moments like this, absorbed in satisfaction gleaned surreptitiously in a steady look from the corner of narrowed eyes, that Basil Valentine added 10 or even twice that many years to the face he showed to others. Even so, his silence evoked nothing as they walked toward the Lion House, no response but an uneven cadence in the footsteps beside him, and he finally questioned, "That cut on your cheek, what is it?"
"I fell in the snow, killing wrens. There. But this—"
"You're done with that drunken inspiration for the priesthood, at any rate. Eh? Tell me what happened."
"What happened? What happened to Huss? John Huss, enticed by a salvo conducto up to Constance, where 3 bishops sat on his case and he was burned."
"Anyone who hints that the Antichrist is to be found in Rome, my dear fellow," Valentine interrupted patiently, "and denies Peter as head of the church—"
"Burned and his ashes thrown into the Rhine, fishing for men. Oh, sancta simplicitas. Yes, I've been off to see good old King Wenceslas, there, and my sainted mother, the women's voices. Do you remember the Boig? Why, I was almost pulled into the priesthood."
"And wasn't that why you went?"
"And if it was, my sainted mother, it's as though I'd left before she named me. Do you remember that story the poet tells? I lay this destiny upon him, that he shall never have a name until he receives one from me. Never mind. The women's voices, and even that one. I left with her kiss on my cheek. See the scar? There, without so much as a Talitha Kumi, I left that wise virgin."
And now, the look from the corners of Valentine's eyes was the same concentrated appraisal of a few steps before. "The last time we talked—"
"Yes, we talked about Shabbatai Zebi, didn't we? It's a way of getting acquainted, discussing the failings of mutual friends. A Messiah? At Smyrna, a letter from God falls out of heaven to confirm him. He's flogged and imprisoned. He denies he's the Messiah, while the Jews outside are breaking their neck to free him, fasting, jumping naked into rivers, remember? They say he's never slept with a woman. Oh, God knows he's been married for years. Before the Sultan he denies it again. He's given the choice of death or Islam. Damnation! Sirius the dog star, the bright star of Yemen, al-Shira. What was it? A sun itself, where it rises with the color of ruby, then sapphire, emerald, amethyst, and then the most brilliant diamond. Damn it, listen! In that immaculate place of yours, Yes, immaculate, a thing like that would show up. It would show up immediately, a package like that, wrapped up in old newspaper."
"You're still bent on this suicide?" Valentine asked, drawing on his cigarette, lowering his hand to take it from his lips. It stuck to his lips, and the coal burned his fingers as they slipped over it. The cigarette dropped to the ground, his lower lip trembled, for that instant at losing control of it. His right hand came up clenched, and behind him his left hand dropped a glove. "But here," he snapped, "will you walk up beside me where I can talk to you instead of—"
"Suicide!"
They were approaching the steps to the Lion House, passing a fat woman on a bench with 2 books in her lap, one gaudy but closed, A Day with the Pope, the other opened, First Lessons in Italian. With a hand mounting 2 mean pearls on a thin line of gold almost absorbed in the flesh, she drew an enameled nail down the page, and then wiped her nose, each time folding the piece of disposable tissue in half until she clutched only a wet wad, forming the words behind it, "Mi piace," with her lips. "Mi piace, mi piace." 3 little girls had just deferred to the clamorous wishes of the smallest of them and bought a balloon. It's been noted, of course, that the thought of suicide has got many a man through a bad night. Nietzsche, I believe.
Suicide? This? Do you think there's only one self, then? That this isn't homicide? Closer to homicide? That... Listen.
Approaching the door, the lines on and around Basil Valentine's eyelids became apparent as he looked at the anxious face turned up to him, and brought out a profile into the smiling duplicity of the full face. The strength seemed to drain out through the narrow chin. "It mayn't be so simple, you know, this so-called homicide of yours," he said. "This putting off the old man." A child posted by the door pointed to a remarkably symmetrical dog spiral on the walk. "Look at that dog do," the child said with intense admiration. "Get out of the way," Valentine snapped, and pushed the child aside with a firm, narrow foot. "Shall we go in?" he asked, still smiling, with a step back to hold the door open. The place was filled with noise coming from the opposite end. Moaning, which broke into a stifled scream, relapsed in a heaving sob, repeated and repeated, interrupted by a hiss and spitting. The animals moved about their cages in the restless patterns of their lives, to turn their heads in that direction as they passed, across the front of the cage, round to the back, emerging again. And the tigers coming forth approached the bars as though they were coming straight through. Some of the animals did not move. A black panther, caged down across the way, stood watching, motionless, but for the black tail whose weaving tip just cleared the floor. Other leopards sat waiting and watched. An albino with pink eyes. The lion lay still, archetype of the calm of enduring vigilance, forepaws extended. The racket went on, leaving only 2 apes, caged halfway down one side, generically unconcerned. "And you don't hate Brown, do you?" Basil Valentine asked abruptly. "For what he's done to you?"
"Brown? Hate him? For what he's done to me?"
"There's a favor I have to ask of you," Valentine went on, as though he considered his question answered.
"That patineer, I remember. You think I don't, but I remember."
"No, something else," Valentine commenced, his tone both fresh and casual. "The Stabat Mater. What do you plan doing?"
"She? Bury her and marry her. After all, she—"
No, that painting. The last one you were working on."
"Why?"
"Well, if you are, as you say, through with all this, I thought I'd rather like to have it." "What's the matter?"
"You? Yes, I told you how fragile situations are. Every moment reshaping the past. You want it?"
"If you'd give it to me, to a friend, a favor to an old friend." Valentine put a hand out to his shoulder, but he turned away.
"Everything down there's destroyed. I burned everything. I put everything into the fireplace and set fire to it."
"But not that. Not that picture, too."
"Why not?"
he demanded, turning. "If it was, as you said, becoming, not Van Eyck, but what you want?"
"What I want,"
he whispered, and shuddered. Moans from the other end rose above the broken echoes of human voices. "The face," Valentine said. "The reproach in that face, it was very beautiful, I thought." Then Valentine felt his wrist gripped tightly.
"Yes, the reproach. That's it, you understand?"
They were halfway down the tiers of cages. "Gee, look at how he does it," said a boy before the ape's cage. "That's a her, and look at her eat it. She's stooping over and eatin' it." The caterwauling rose. The 2 pumas, as they would prove to be, were in the last cage to the right. Next to them, and separated by a metal wall, a white African lioness brushed the bars of her cage, stalked to the back, and came forth round a tree trunk in the center, its length torn by her claws and teeth. Her tail wove to one side and the other, and she twisted to bare her teeth and snap at it, making no pause when the cries in the next cage broke. "Weh, weh, weh, it's all right, beautiful lady. Yes, come on. You gonna eat it all up today? You gonna eat your tail all up? Yes. Weh, weh, weh," said a woman before the cage, sharp-nosed with too much makeup. She held out a skinny hand with a ring mounting a miserable stone to the lioness.
"Listen, you see why it's important now?"
Shocked as much by the smile fixed on him as he was by the grip fastening his wrist, Valentine had started to withdraw. The instant his arm tightened, the hazardous hand left it, but the smile persisted, and Valentine asked, "Why, what's important?"
"Yes, clearing up all this, those fragments, if they won't believe me. If you saw it too, in that face? The eyes turned away, the eyes not looking at you, but the forgiveness, the grace. Yes, but even in that, the reproach, if you saw it too, that reproach, you understand then, don't you? How I've felt since that dream. The 7 sins, when they come to confess and be shrived. The second dream, I don't remember, the first one, but the second one, he wakes up, but he goes to sleep again over his prayers, and there's reason, preaching a field full of folk, and one by one, superbia, invidia.
"Damn it!"
What?
"I've dropped a glove somewhere," Valentine said in a tone which penetrated the cry of the puma. Before him the lioness came forward with her head lowered and out to one side, waiting for him to appear in her view. Then their eyes met, and without turning from her as she did from him, passing the bars, he added, "Come now, what is all this?"
"I'll tell you about it. Listen. When I was away, I dreamt. I had 2 dreams, I think. But the first one, I don't remember the first one, but the other one, sitting bolt upright in a chair, was it? And there she was, she touched me. Her lips were blue like indigo, and I didn't understand it then, but now you can see, yes, that reproach, if you saw it too. You can see that I can't just go to her like this, after what I've done, and done to her, that I couldn't just go to her and offer her this. What's left?"
"What is it? All this dream?" Valentine interrupted, not turning, nor raising his voice, nor his attention, which seemed to seethe and recede with the shape of the lioness looming toward the bars and retiring. "This face in that study?"
"Yes. And you see why it's crucial. Why, when we've settled all this, and we can leave—"
"Leave?" Valentine took a step back. Without looking round, his hand caught the wrist rising before him. "Tell me, what are you talking about?"
She?
This Stabat Mater? Dolorosa? It's she standing over you, is it? Isn't it? Yes, you've told me, this blessed Queen of Heaven." Valentine looked up quickly as the lioness turned away. The hissing in the next cage rose to broken cries. "Yes, your mother, isn't it? Your sainted mother?"
"My mother?"
He twisted in Valentine's hold, which was not tight, but rigidly closed on his wrist. Beyond Valentine's shoulder, across the way, the rigid pattern of the bars was broken by dark blonde hair and dark eyes, the abrupt, aware delicacy of a woman of undamaged beauty who turned from the leopard cage to look for the child with her. She carried a fur coat over the arm of a tailored suit, and her expensive walking shoes lent purpose to the steps of her slender frame, deceptively fragile, full-bosomed, and, again, so well-tailored that modesty was such only because she could afford simplicity, turning now to catch, for an instant, the eyes in the distraught face turned for no reason to her. He mumbled, or cleared a constricted throat, which was it? And she moved on quickly. "Your blessed Queen of Heaven?" Basil Valentine seemed to force attention to his words as he stared into the cage where the lioness came forth again with her head lowered, turning to look up, paused at the bars with forelegs crossed left over right, and then with no effort leaped to one side and was gone. This woman, the women's voices, and did I see the moon last night, this, good heavens, like Lucius in the golden ass, eh? Valentine faltered on, unwilling to pause and allow contradiction, postponing denial with whatever memory crowded upon him, casting up shattered shapes and fragments, shapes and smells. And you, I suppose you went down and plunged your head 7 times in the sea? You, little by little I seemed to see the whole figure of her body, bright and mounting out of the sea and standing before me. One recalls her odoriferous feet, but— Yes, so it's not, then? Not your mother at all, that reproach and all the rest of it? Unwilling to stop until his hold was broken, unwilling to let go the wrist until it turned from his hand, unwilling to listen until their embrace was sundered by laughter. My mother? Why, she— Good God, she in the painting? Yes, you told me, you know. A boy in the remnants, or perhaps the beginnings of a Boy Scout uniform, had got between Valentine and the bars, and reached out over the rail. "Gimme your tail, Zimba," he said. The sharp-nosed woman repeated, "Yes, where?" The lioness approached, looking beyond them. "It's some girl you've picked up, is it? And all this talk about clearing things up, it's all some notion she's—" No, not that. All that is still itself. It's only part of itself. Really? Do you hear me? Really? And tell me, who is this Solveig of yours, this Senta? The girl you've been using to model, I suppose. Didn't Brown say he'd sent along something? Listen. And how is it I didn't see her the night I dropped in on you? But she doesn't— We've never even— "Gimme a tail, Zimba," the boy said between them and the cage. Or is it all in this fantasy of yours, eh? Yes, I'm working it out, and everything fits. Everything fits so far, everything. And that dream, I told you about that. Why, you've dreamt? And afterward you meet them, who you dreamt of? What an advantage! You know things they don't know, things about them they don't know that you know, things they've done they never suspect you know. Why, they can go right on talking as though nothing had happened. Yes, like the saints. Rose of Lima? And what innocency of hers was woven into her past by her Jesuit confessor? What defense have they against our fantasies? And meeting her again, can she imagine what she's shared? Where she's been enjoyed in privacy? Can she imagine the postures and pleasures she's shared? And you know, all the time, what an advantage you have over people you've dreamt of. "Gimme a tail, gimme a tail, gimme a tail!" So you understand how important this is, how crucial. Basil Valentine turned and laughed in his face. Really, my dear fellow. No, he said, clutching the single grey glove before him. The sombre glow at the end of the second act, is it? The duet with Senta. Is that it? The sombre glow, no, it is salvation that I crave, eh? Might such an angel come my soul to save? Your Flying Dutchman sings, eh? Good heavens. And up they go to heaven in a wave, or whatever it was, really. In all that foolishness you were carrying on with the last time I saw you, that I mean tro and the rest of it. That where has he been all this time, and your Solveig answers, in my faith, in my hope, in my— Good heavens, you are romantic, aren't you? If you do think you mean all this— And then what? They lived happily forever after? But listen, she— No, it's too easy. After all, you know, with no interruption— Valentine paused, looking into the cage of the lioness. The lioness had come to the middle of the cage, watching him. She went round the tree trunk, where her tail followed close, circling it. She stopped and moaned at the tail. She turned and bit at it. Then she moaned and faced him again. He did not speak until threatened by the voice beside him, then went on derisively, "And St. Rose of Lima? Why, this sudden attempt to set the whole world right by recalling your own falsifications in it? And then, happiness ever after? Then you will be redeemed and redeem her, and good heavens knows what. And then what next? First it's Shabbatai Zebi, now it's the Flying Dutchman." "Listen to me," he went on, his voice dropping. "This lost innocence you're so frantic to recover, it goes a good deal farther back, you know. And this idea that you can set everything to rights at once is childish. I know what it's like with Brown, of course I know. I know you can't go on like that. But you and I, my dear fellow—" The broken cries from the next cage had stopped, given over to heaving and groans.
"What? You and I what?"
"Listen to me," Basil Valentine said, suddenly closing his grip on the wrist he'd recovered without taking his eyes from those of the lioness. "Do you remember when I told you that the gods have only one secret to teach?" Neither was looking at the other. Over Valentine's shoulder the blonde woman reached the child who had run to her. She was bent down now, listening, her skirt drawn tight, her jacket full with the weight of her breasts, her face alive with attention. "Were they really fighting?" she asked, still inclined over the child, being led back to the next cage where the pumas were, in her choice that toned children accept as awe, delighting to shock the innocence of those who awe them. "That secret, do you remember?" said Basil Valentine, still holding him tight there, and still looking himself into the cage of the lioness.
"What Wotan taught his son, the only secret worth having?"
"But how were they fighting?" "The power of doing without happiness," Basil Valentine said. "See?" said the child. She saw. She pulled the child to her, and looked quick into the other faces before the puma cage. They were all men. They all found her upturned face instantly, caught her dark eyes, one with a smile, one grinned an intimate recognition, until seeking escape she found herself looking into eyes familiar from a minute before. Eyes not drawn to her by this instant of leveling, but still fixed on her. Eyes which made no response at all. So she continued to stare at him where he stood held in Valentine's grip there, for moments, finding sanctuary where she could recover, all so abruptly assaulted, in eyes which shared nothing, recognized nothing, accused her of nothing. But those moments passed, and recovering, she groped for escape. But that lack of response held her. That lack of recognition no more sanctuary than the opened eyes of a dead man. That negation no asylum for shame, but the trap from which it cried out for the right to its living identity. She clutched the child by the shoulder as one essays handhold climbing from a pit, and turned to stare into the cage of the pumas, reddening over her face and neck, and, though none knew it but she, to the very breaking away of her breasts. The sun was visible, white in a sky which showed no premonition but in its fleeting neighborhood. The fat woman had followed it, from her chill seat near the seals to another facing the sun, though she did not look up so far, no further than passing waist levels, mouthing behind her damp wad or the faces of children, "Frere Jacka, dormez-vous," one sang. "What's that?" asked the smallest. "Sunny Malatina, what's that mean?" asked the smallest, and the string of the balloon slipped from her finger. "It don't mean nothing, stupid, it's French. And look you lost your balloon already." How old Valentine might have looked to someone who'd shared with him the cruel familiarities of youth. Or are there moments of intimacy of which only strangers are capable? of which those known and suffered over years could never conceive, so seeking for their own reflection in the attrition of familiarity. So the fat woman mouthing, "Grazie, grazie," behind her damp wad, looked up as though she might in that instant know the history of every line around his eyes, but only lacked the time to set it down anywhere, even in her own, or set it down in prescience, not magic, not art, but only history before it happened, not age as mere accomplishment, but in performance, living out what would be lived out, age knowing itself, earning itself in that instant and gone, until all she could have told if she'd been interrupted a moment later, surprised, indignant, mouthing "Grazie," probably all she could answer would be, how old he looked just then, throwing that gray glove into the ash-can when he came out of the cat-house. What now? The sun? A priest of Mithras, was it? Come along, my dear fellow, I'll tell you why Mithraism failed. The greatest rival Christianity ever had. It failed because it lacked central authority. It spread all over the country with the Roman legions, but Christianity was a city religion, and power lies in cities, remember that. And what was it you said? A man's damnation is his own damned business. It's not true, you know. It's not true. Why, good heavens, this suicide of yours. Why, like Chrysippus, then? Feeding figs and wine to an ass and dying of laughter? Look there in the sky where it's still blue, that line? That white line the airplane's drawn, do you see it? How the winds billowed it out like rope in a current of water. Yes, your man in the celestial sea, eh? Coming down to undo it, down to the bottom, and they find him dead as though drowned. Why, this Pelagian atmosphere of yours, you know. Homicide, was it? What was it Pascal said? There's as much difference between us and ourselves as between ourselves and others. No, but that was Montaigne, wasn't it? He stooped a little, finding his way up the steps to the street. At the corner, the three children stopped to look at a deer hung there by its hind feet, to remark, "Look at where they stuck the paper flower!" From down the block, two women approached. "And I just haven't been the same since the Moro Castle," the tall woman said, and laughed. "And I wish I could, but I can't. This dismal cocktail party tonight. My husband has to go. He's her editor, and I'm his wife. We're going to miss the Narcissus Festival in Hawaii again this year. I told him we'd just have one of our own." Basil Valentine's hands were clenched deep in his coat pockets. "Now? A Turkish bath?" he muttered. "Well, don't worry, those fragments. I'll be there tonight. I'll be at Brown's." And he looked up as though watching something blown on the wind. Ahead, the three children approached a figure sprawled on the sidewalk, and a little boy on a tricycle wheeling round it. "What's that?" asked the smallest. "A man. What's it look like?" "It looks like a Santa Claus. What it's wearing, it looks like it was a Santa Claus suit, don't it?" "How could it be a Santa Claus? It don't have a white beard." "But it's getting a beard." Valentine's look was not so steady. He raised it every 3 or so steps with that sort of blank surprise of a man glancing up to where he has been used to seeing a mirror upon entering a room and finding a blank wall. "At Philippi," he murmured. "Yes. Why, I will see thee at Philippi, then." Like the sky, his eyes remained unclouded, but perhaps it was the sky beyond him that did it, simply darkened evenly, assuming a hard solidity and the enduring texture of gray, as the sky itself was doing, as one might have seen looking up at them both. The tall woman turned her friend in at a door before the stubble-chinned figure sprawled on the walk in front of her house. Right under the dining-room window, in fact, right here, as she remarked, in front of God and everybody. She almost tripped over the tricycling child, but got the rail and down the steps to say, "My husband says that's when you have to be careful around lunchtime. That's when most of them jump. When the streets are full of people, they do it then for the publicity." Above her, the sky darkened. She did not look at it, but went in with her eyes on her own hand, laid out at elegant length on her friend's fur, while behind her, outside, the tricycle wove smaller and smaller circles, as its rider watched over the left shoulder how close the rear tire could come to the fingers on the pavement. By late afternoon, it was snowing. The flakes were small, blown neither one side nor the other, nor falling direct to earth, but filling the air with continuous movement. Mickey Mouse pointed to 10 minutes of 4. The first thing she saw when she entered her apartment was the unnatural radiance of the sun lamp. Agnes Day paused there, still holding her keys, as though to appreciate fully the affliction before her, worse second by second as she hesitated, considering what might have happened had she not arrived, even perhaps that there was still time for her to leave, quietly as she had come, back into the transfigurating weather. But before she was able to contain this possibility sufficient to examine it, and find there one of those mortal shocks with which life rarely presents us opportunity to abandon the bonds of circumstances woven with such care, and start off upon any of 1,000 alternative courses, among which, like the needle in the haystack, lies the real one. Habit betrays us, as it betrayed Agnes Day. She put a hand on the Swede's shoulder and made a sound. "Ow-way! What? How long have you been asleep under this thing? What time is it?" "Almost 4, she said, and finally turned the sun lamp off. "Oh, my God! I've been here for... Ow! What shall I do?" the Swede wailed. "There's some butter. I'll get some butter." So that is what she did. "I'll die," she heard him a minute later from the bathroom, applying it. "How could it happen? But just look at me." Instead, she looked away and said, "I wish you'd—" But she had looked away in time, and broke off, biting her lip, her eyes fixed at the same level, staring at a table lamp, as though she could not raise them. "Baby! Ooh!" "I wish you'd put something around you," she said, recovered, looking up and caught her lip again, for it had almost happened again. She had almost said what she did not know she meant, instead of what she meant to say. Just as that day in the office, when she had intended to ask, "Are you Catholic?" and had suddenly heard herself demand, "Do you believe in God?" The Swede had got back into the bathroom. Agnes Day sat down and opened the only letter that was waiting for her. She read, "Dear Madam, the case you reported to us as sadism and brutality, reported by you to this precinct, Tuesday, December 20th, at 10:17 a.m., resulted in false arrest, for which you may be held responsible. Dr. Weisgall, who you accused, was punishing his daughter, in which case, unless injury results, no third party is obliged to intervene. This case is marked closed in our files, but we feel it our duty to warn you that if at future date you accuse someone of criminal action, that you investigate the facts thoroughly before reporting it to the police. We also feel it our duty to warn you that Dr. Weisgall may be justified in communicating with you as agent of his unjust arrest, and any future action will take place between yourself and the injured party." "Baby, who sent you roses?" The Swede had emerged, clothed. Agnes looked up. She made a sound, almost told him, and bit her lip on that stark, erect syllable. Then her telephone rang. "What?" she said into it, shaken. "Hello?"
Hello, Mrs. Day?
Baby, I've got to find a doctor. Yes, what is it? Who is it?
I'm sorry, this is Stanley, and I think I left my glasses at your house once, and when could how...
I hate to run off like this, baby, but I'll call you from the hospital, probably. But I can't go to the hospital on Christmas Eve. Stanley, I'm so glad you called. Yes, I found them. I found your glasses, Stanley, but I won't be home now. I'm going to a party in a little while. But could you come there? Couldn't you meet me there?
But I'm getting a toothache, but yes, all right, I can come for a little while, but I have to go up to this new hospital where they moved my mother.
Yes, here's the address. She read it to him, and almost a full minute passed after she'd hung up the phone and sat staring at the letter she'd just received before she looked up and realized she was alone. Immediately she got pen and paper and started to write. Dear Dr. Weisgall, I cannot begin to tell you how sorry I am for my recent mistake. How can I explain it to you so that you will forgive me? A woman's life is not... She stopped and read that, as she would stop and read again and again, until the letter on the edge of the wastebasket started, Dear Dr. Weisgall, perhaps it is not until late in life that we realize that we do not ever pay for our own mistakes. We pay for the mistakes of others, and they... And the letter, which fluttered to the floor, Dear Sir, I trust that you are intelligent enough to distinguish between a vulgar act of meanness and revenge, which God knows I have no reason to commit, and the act of a citizen and a human being doing what she believes, when she got up to find 2 strips of tape. Then she stood at the window, stretching the skin at her temples, sticking the tape there to discourage wrinkles while she rested. Unblinking, she stared out at the snowfall a minute longer, and when she turned on the room, her moving eyes found the roses. They were full-blown with the steam heat, and that instant her gaze struck them. 3 petals fell. The snowflakes frolicked about the Swede's face, which was growing larger and more brilliantly red by the minute. He hit at them as though they were a flight of insects sent to plague him. It did no good. They came from every hand until, seeing a bar, he fled from the white swarm inside, where patrons looked with impolite interest at his high, buttered countenance. He got into the telephone booth, after only 1 drink, and dialed. I came out of this blizzard to find a doctor, but I don't know any doctors.
My doctor's away on vacation, in prison. I can't think which. The tone was vague. He dialed 3 more numbers, got no answer, and returned to the bar to try to think of telephone numbers.
Nothing?
Nothing. Nothing at all except this wet, said Maud, standing against the door she had closed behind her. Snow crystals melted and dripped from her coat to the floor. I had to come home in a taxicab.
The same judge?
Oh, yes. And I almost hate him, even though he does look like Daddy.
That's a good sound reason itself.
Arnie, please don't be cruel. Not today. It's Christmas Eve, Arnie. I feel so awful. Even when my doctor said, Does she look like she's malingering to you? Would you undergo an operation on your spine if you were malingering? And their lawyer said he was sorry, but... Oh, Arnie, I get so tired.
Do you want a drink?
No, my doctor gave me some morphine. Are you drinking this early?
Just a couple before I have to start drinking at the party.
Arnie, I wish you wouldn't drink so much. Have you filled out the papers?
What papers?
The papers, you know. The ones for the... I can't pronounce it. For Sweden. He planned to fill out these papers, declaring their fitness as parents, after the party.
Now he poured the last of a bottle of whiskey into his glass and sat down slowly, making a wry face, supporting the lower part of his abdomen with a hand inside his trouser pocket.
"I'm hungry," he said abruptly. "I didn't have any lunch."
"Do you want some spaghetti?" Maud said vaguely.
"Spaghetti in the middle of the afternoon?" he mumbled, as she went toward the kitchen.
But what Maud thought was spaghetti turned out to be a box of waxed paper. She offered salad, but they were out of whiskey. When he went out for some, she sped him with, "But get a quart. There's something sinful about a pint of whiskey."
"Sinful?"
"Well, naughty." She sat down wearily, and had hardly managed to assume that suspended look of a passenger on a railway train, which came over her when alone, when the telephone and the doorbell both rang at once. She shuddered right through her frame, put out a hand in each direction, and finally got to the door. But when she'd let Herschel in and picked up the telephone, all she could say was, "What?"
"Baby, do you know a doctor? I need a doctor." "A bone doctor?" Maud managed. She looked helplessly at Herschel. "I've just had the most terrible accident."
"Baby, are you in the hospital?" Herschel answered, taking the thing.
"No, but I will be, if you'll just tell me a doctor."
"But where are you, baby? I always told you this would happen. No one can drive the way you do and go on living in this world."
"But it isn't an automobile accident. I have sunstroke."
"Who is this?"
"It's me."
"Oh, you. I thought it was you-know-who. Sunstroke. Are you drinking?"
"Second-degree burns at the very least. Stop asking sillies."
"Listen, baby, we're going to a party. You just come there and we'll find you the cutest little doll doctor you ever. Now, listen, here's the address."
And when he'd hung up, Herschel turned to Maud.
"And I've had the most day. You cannot dream where I woke up. Can you tell I have this shirt on inside out?"
"Who was that?"
Maud asked, motioning at the telephone.
"It was Rudy. I think he's been in an auto crash or something. He said the strangest things. He must have hit his head. And so I just told him to come right along to Esther's cocktail. Baby, is there a clean shirt? Because I can't possibly go anywhere in this."
He followed her into the bedroom, where Maud opened a bureau drawer and took out Arnie's last clean shirt. When Arnie arrived with a full quart by the throat, Herschel was already revealing his latest arcanum.
Chardonnay. It really doesn't mean anything, but it's familiar to everybody if you say it quickly. They mention a painter's style, you nod and say, "Rather Chardonnay," or "He's rather derivative of Chardonnay, wouldn't you say?" Spending the summer? Yes, in the south of France, a little villa near Chardonnay. Poets, movie stars, perfume, Chardonnay, Herschel brayed becomingly.
The evening of this feast day, for so it was, perennially addressed to SS Adam and Eve and the 40 maidens martyred at Antioch, was brisk or cold, according to one's resources. The people in the streets had not changed. Most of them certainly were the same people who might be seen passing the same points with the same expressions at the same hour on almost any of the 365 feast days of the year. Nevertheless, something had happened. There was a quality in the air which every passing figure seemed to intensify, a professional quality, as everyone became more consciously, more insistently, what the better part of the time he either pretended or was forced to pretend himself to be. This was as true for each quantum in the bustling stream of anonymity, moving forth in an urgency of its own, as it was for such prodigies of the tyranny of public service as the policeman, offering expressionless faces cut and weathered in the authority of red stone, and their contraries, a porous group in uniforms of low saturation and low brilliance gathered round something on the sidewalk before the American Bible Society, an object so compelling that it gave their diligent chaos the air of order. It appeared to be a gigantic male Heidi.
Cross the arms on the chest, Maurice. Oh, right there. Get his feet. Wait a minute, don't lift yet until I tell you.
The policeman, busy elsewhere attending the smooth functioning of that oppressive mechanism which they call law and order, looked as unlikely of ever being seen in any other combination of lip, nostril, and cold eye, badge, uniform, and circumstance as St. Gaudens's statue of the Puritan. In the same way, the Boy Scouts hazarded neither past nor future, heirs to all the ages and the foremost files of time notwithstanding, they composed and expressed a pattern endowed with permanency.
Look out for his head. You want to break something? How'd it get so red? He's red all the way down, and I looked. So how'd he get that way? You tell us. Your father's a doctor.
"Be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only," said a lighted sign behind them. In the window was a large loose-leaf book, whose lined pages were filled in a cramped round hand. A sign beside it said, "It took Mrs. Gill 15 years to copy the Bible. The Bible was presented to her son at Christmas." There was a picture of Mrs. William Gill of New York City and her hand-copied Bible.
You passed first aid, Maurice? Merit badge. What do you say? Artificial respiration? Right. Take his feet there and twist. He won't roll, he's big. Twist.
They stepped back as the hulk rolled and the nose hit the pavement.
Cup the face in the arm there. Okay. Get on him. You get on him. I'll get on him. We'll both get on him. Okay, ready with your side? 1, 2, 3, go! 2, 3, push! 2, 3, push! Sweet little boys. He's talking. He said something. He's got me by the knee. Sweet little boys.
The police, too, were busy in as serious, if less concerted, pursuits. In the 14th Street IRT BMT subway station, one of them reached Hannah. A policewoman handed that nomadic laundress over to the stronger arm of the law. "You might at least have given me time to rinse them," Hannah said, a note of hauteur distinct in her voice as she gathered the wet clothes up under her arm. Earlier she had gone to see Stanley. She had knocked at his door and found him not at home. Even going round to the front and peering through the bars of the grating and the dirty window, all she had been able to see was in order, that silent, patient order of things abandoned. She could make out the picture of the cathedral at Fenestrula, the stacks of paper, palimpsests on the left, untouched to the right, 12 empty staves to a page, but already dedicated, and she realized with a twinge of cold, as though the cold brought it to her clearly for the first time, not to her. Peering in, she saw all this, even enough of the bed to ascertain that it, too, was empty. She could see everything in his room, in fact, except the crucifix, for it hung above the bed, next to the window through which she peered. This willful insistence of finality was so pervasive that, on those occasions which seemed to resist, an element which might too easily have been called fateful intruded, heavy-handed somewheres as though fate had become exasperated. In others, no more than the cajoling hand of cooperation. Stanley's mother had been transferred to a first-floor room in a large municipal hospital, pleading the entire journey for her possessions. After Stanley's visit, her attendants might have noted that there was something more than the usual immediate anxiety in her voice, which had deepened with her demands to a tone which implied that they would never have opportunity to separate her from another of them. Had they brought her appendix, her tonsils, her severed limb, and her teeth? The denture was put into a clean glass on the bedside table, where the nurse, watching the doctor leave, poured the wrong solution into the glass without spilling a drop, and left her old patient gazing at that submarine chimera. Stanley's mother gazed. It moved gently, suspended, as though melting there before her eyes. She dug nut-sized knuckles into her eyes and looked again. Gumming imprecations of an exhausted nostalgia, she slept. She woke, jolted into consciousness by a belch, pulling her 3 limbs toward her, startled. What was it? She looked into the glass. There was nothing in the glass but a placid, clear solution with a slight pink precipitation on the bottom. It was too much. She must get where she was going while there was still time. Who but a priest, dead for 1,000 years, could have read the words which formed themselves on those remnants of lips, as she made her way informally across the room, moving as though encouraged by fitful gusts of wind, weightless, like a sail without a ship, toward the window-sill. The window slid up easily. The shade rolled up like a shot. The forceps shifted. The music began, and she crossed herself, nightmare of the girl she had been 2 generations before, running to the water's edge, stopping for a breathless instant there to commend her own salvation before she dove in. Transfixed below, the darkness unfurled upward, pierced by lights at each point in its ascendance until it hung, impaled on the city. Over and under the ground he hurried home. Mr. Pivner's lips moved as he walked. Perhaps it was this compliment which gave him, as the seasonal festoons gave the pitted face of the city, this intense quality of immediate realization. Real, no longer opposed to ostensible, but now in the abrupt coalescence of necessity. Real, no longer opposed to factitious, nor, as in law, opposed to personal, nor as in philosophy, distinguished from ideal, nor the real number of mathematics having no imaginary part, but real, filled out to embrace those opponents, which made its definition possible, and so, once defined, capable of resolving the paradox in the moment, when the mask and the face became one, the eternal moment of the Cartesian God, who can will a circle to be square. Mr. Pivner's monologue was neither gibberish nor absent mumbling. In a clear, if inaudible voice, he was accounting for every one of his movements. It was difficult to know, and he might have had difficulty himself saying, whether he was carefully preparing an explanation or believed himself actually before a tribunal where he had been summoned to account for his movements. What had once been anxious inclination was become severe practice. It might have been brought on by the hours he had so recently suffered at the hands of the police, an inquiry which had been, by the standards of almost everyone else who passed through the station-house that day, an indifferent, even tedious procedure, in light of the compass of their own applied and again detected talents. For Mr. Pivner, it worked quite the other way, and it was, perhaps, just this quality of merciless boredom with which his captors treated him, the entirely disinterested manner with which their relentlessness pursued him, that impressed his own impersonal presence in the world most deeply upon him. Under their questioning he began to see himself capable of almost anything, someone to be watched and accounted for after those awkward incidents which composed the biography of the city whose turbulent diary he was accustomed to following in the newspapers. He looked at his wristwatch, lowered it as his lips kept moving, and abruptly raised it again. First to his eyes, then his ear, and walked faster. He bought a newspaper, turned his corner, and it was not until he was mounting motionless in the elevator that his lips stopped, finishing his account to the tribunal as he approached his own door, and the locked-up disposal of witnesses waiting to confirm him. The key half in the lock, he paused, listened, and moved frantically, shaking the door to get it open and himself through, to strike at the light switch and reach the telephone, which he seized and raised so quickly that it hit him in the eye. "Hello? Hello?" He heard that sound of patient vacancy, which is called the dial tone. "Hello? Hello, operator!" His hand quivered over the dial. He spun it all the way. "What number were you calling, please?"
Operator, didn't this... I'm sorry, I thought I heard it ring.
He moved more slowly, returning to the hallway to remove his hat and coat and pick up his newspaper. He placed the newspaper on the table beside his chair, turned on the radio, and went into the bathroom. He came back, carrying his medicine and a syringe, paused to change the station on the radio for no reason but to change it, and returned to his chair to relax into that state of spiritual unemployment which he called leisure. Then her eyes caught his, staring out at him wistfully from the harsh newspaper reproduction where she stood patient in long white stockings, and Mr. Pivner looked confused, as though he'd been abruptly handed back among the classic peoples of pre-Christian times, whose dates, declining with the advance of time, had always given him the feeling that they had lived backwards. He picked up the paper, and his eyes followed automatically the feature story account of the little Spanish girl soon to be canonized, while his mind rummaged its rich embarrassment of glories and defeats no longer news for recognition. He opened the page and saw the headline on the bus gone down a Chilean ravine, killing 1 American and 11 natives, before he realized it was an old paper, and looked at the date to be sure. He folded it quickly and thrust it at a wastebasket behind him. He found the paper he'd just brought in, and settled back with a sigh, a weary sound suggesting a suspicion, if he had stopped to reconnoiter, that if the evil thereof is sufficient unto the day, so is it to a place. For had he known, no great disaster had occurred in that region of Chile where the bus crashed since the 19th century, when the cave-in of a burning church gave hundreds of bereaved families grief sufficient for decades. And these 11 new and sudden deaths were enough to be mourned for another score of years, deeply felt without publicity, realized in their full right as suffering and death, ungalled by the attrition of a world's tragedies circulated elsewhere on what had been but remained there hectares of green trees. "If you can count, you can paint," he read. An advertisement in the evening paper. "New subjects for your paint-it-yourself collection." And his lip drew in the tick which came when he was weary. For over this artistic suggestion loomed the spectre of his retirement. Yes, even if your artistic talents are zero, you'll be able to decorate your house from wall to wall with fine paintings, and be able to say, "I did it myself." The music was Francesco Manfredini's Christmas Concerto, approaching resolution in the last movement, only to cease abruptly in favor of a voice laden with the viscous pauses of sincerity, feigning itself the last movement of that concerto, interrupted with such confident presumption, as though in those minutes of music the listener had got not bored but lonely, even alarmed at being left so long abandoned to the allurements of some possibility of beauty. Isolating in confident repetition the name of a product which had the distinction of never having been a word in any language, the voice came to the rescue, stickily compelling, glutinously articulate. Just match your numbered pre-planned canvas to the numbered pre-mixed paints. If you can count, you just can't miss, he read, before he turned the page, this reasonable appeal, his head already nodding over retirement from the means which had become the only reasonable end. Still it was to him that they appealed, and a hand went to his pocket, where the past, his own, for there was no other, lay coined in justification. With his last attention, he noted that the Burma Translation Society had published How to Win Friends and Influence People, and that Yu Nu, Thakin Nu, hoped for more books so that his nation would not remain static as ignoramuses. This indeed is a matter of life and death to all of us. His eyes closed slowly, and when he thought, he fastened his hand on his extravasated heart, glad if only of recognition and familiarity, proof against reason, and the cries of the mendicant past. When the doorbell rang, Mr. Pivner started violently and grabbed the telephone. "Hello? Hello?" The doorbell rang again. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said to the sound of patient vacancy. "I thought—" He received the large package from the delivery boy, a wild-eyed figure about twice his own age, who stood waiting dumbly for something more than his words of gratitude. "For me? Pivner? Is it addressed to me?" "Oh, Wait," he said unnecessarily. "Here." He fetched a quarter up from his pocket, which was accepted with a grunt. As the old man turned away, Mr. Pivner stopped staring at the package and cried out, "Wait, here, Merry Christmas." He handed over 50 cents. The robe was too big. Nevertheless, the pattern was so conservative and the material so fine that this seemed rather a mark of luxuriance than some deliberate hebitude on the part of the giver. Also, in a way, it marked the thing as a gift, for had he got it himself, it would have fit perfectly. For that reason, any notion of exchanging it left his mind directly it arose there. The card said simply, "Merry Christmas from Otto." And though he was surprised when he realized it, was it really any wonder at all that Mr. Pivner, whose world was a series of disconnected images, his life a procession of faces reflecting his own anonymity in the street, and faces sharing moments of severe intimacy in the press, any wonder that before he knew it, he had beseeched familiarity, and found himself staring at the image of Eddie Zefnik, as he sat running the end of his finger over the fine ridges of wool challis draped across his knee. Wearing the robe, he stood up. He looked about him for something to do, something which, done while wearing the robe, would establish it as his own. First thing he noticed, there on the photograph album, was his syringe. He picked it up, noted that he had intended to attach a new needle, and went into his bedroom to get one. He opened a small upper drawer, and as he took a needle out, the dull luster of gold caught his eye. He lifted the watch out by its chain and dangled it there for a moment before he opened it. He pressed the stem with the heel of his palm and caught the opening spring of the hunting case on his fingertips. Then he stood staring at that unchanged continent face, the hands stopped upon his father's forsaken past at 12. Though whether noon or midnight he did not know. The hunting case closed with a snap on this instrument which seemed, as his hand closed upon it, capable of containing time in continuum, where all things, even ends, might be possible of accomplishment. Mr. Pivner put the watch into the pocket of his robe, feeling as he did so Otto's card there. He put the card into the drawer where the watch had been, and returned to the other room with the fresh needle. Still it was to him they appealed, for that time coined dead in his pocket. In just a moment, Necro-style will bring you the correct time. But first, friends, do you feel dull, logy, just not up to much, first thing in the morning? Well, Mr. Pivner took his injection with great care, as he always did. When he was finished, he was told that the correct time was 6:30. He was startled at that, and on second thought he lifted the gold watch out of his pocket by its chain, opened it, and pulling out a lever on the side, he turned the stem and brought the gold filigree hands into concert with his own affairs. Every hour on the half hour, the latest news, brought to you by... He was suddenly in a hurry. He removed the robe with reluctant care and put on his jacket. He moved around the room, straightening things, or only touching them, as the voice rehearsed unimproved details of the war which no one talked about, commencing a summary of the same news summarized an hour before, which it had taken that hour to rewrite. He hung the robe carefully, and noticing its lopsidedness as he did so, removed the gold watch and put it into his vest pocket, not pausing to thread the chain through a buttonhole, for he was in a hurry, having intended to reach the hotel well before 7 o'clock tonight. He put on his coat and the green scarf, and had his hat in hand before he went out to turn off the radio, waiting courteously, as he did from habit, for the voice to finish a last-minute bulletin. In the metropolitan area, police are on the lookout tonight for a large man with a red, noticeably swollen face, who is believed to have abducted a group of 7 Boy Scouts. It had begun to snow again. Mr. Pivner hurried along the slippery sidewalk and caught a bus almost immediately. It did, in fact, wait for him, which put him in even better spirits as he sat down and looked out the window, allowing himself to marvel at this dreadnought which bore him away to the south, and the wonders of science which made it, not simply possible, but ordinary. Then the bus drew to a stop, and moved again, reduced to a crawl, a cautious hulk in the solid dark line of vehicles. Traffic in the other direction was stopped, and as though conducting tourists reverently past a venerable setting of martyrdom, the bus crept past the figure of a man on the glistening wet surface of the street. One of his feet was balanced up on the toe. His hat was 4 feet away, and all that moved was his smashed umbrella, its black festoons stirred by bits of wind. It was the image of the foot, so delicately awry, which held Mr. Pivner even as they went on. His bus passed another, stopped in line in the opposite direction. His driver leaned out to call to the other driver. "You got a knockdown." Mr. Pivner's lips were moving again. He opened his newspaper and stared for a moment at the headline. "Minister dies in 51-day fast, seeking perfect will of God," trying to compose himself. Then he turned the pages looking for that ad, "If you can count, you can paint." There were times when he had considered taking up a hobby, painting or building ships in bottles, but something that would interest him. Seeking those words, "I did it myself," his eye caught a picture. Raise chinchillas in your own home. No mess, no trouble. They all appealed to him, counting him excellently satisfactory just as he was, but if, on learning mistrust so late, he was not, how would they reward his ingratitude? How requite his betrayal? Science assures us that it is getting nearer to the solution of life, what life is, that is, the ultimate mystery, and offers anonymously promulgated submicroscopic chemistry in eager substantiation. But no one has even begun to explain what happened at the dirt track in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, about 25 years ago, when Jimmy Concannon's car threw a wheel, and in a crowd of 11,000 it killed his mother. Mr. Pivner stared at the chinchillas. They looked warm. "Here's to fire, not the kind that burns down shanties," he found himself reading a few minutes later, bound by necessity before this scribbling on the wall. He shifted his eyes, chagrined at being seen staring with such attentive preoccupation at this, and the various graffiti surrounding it, even by the young man similarly preoccupied and equivalently occupied beside him. But the pictograph his eye caught was so alarming that he lowered his eyes, glimpsing in that brief embarrassed sweep the face beside him, a haggard face drawn over a sharp profile which stared intently ahead. And his eyes were drawn slowly back up this figure his own height, near the same stature, slowly up, then snagged, drawn up short and back, caught on a corner of green. And he was staring at that, down at the bit of wool protruding from the coat's pocket, waist level, when the whole face turned on him, turned bloodshot eyes in a desolation of contempt. Instantly Mr. Pivner returned square before him. "But the kind that burns in young girls' panties." And after a shrugged fluster and buttoning beside him, he was alone. "Is that old jerk going to come in here every night now, just sitting here in the lobby?" the tall bellboy demanded as he emerged a moment later, and the night manager approached him. "Perhaps you would care to sit in the bar for the rest of the evening, sir?" "That young man," Mr. Pivner managed, who just left?" "I believe he has been a guest of the hotel." "Oh, well, yes. Well, then, no." Mr. Pivner lowered his eyes to the shining tips of the night manager's shoes. "But—" he looked up suddenly, eyes as bright and incurious as the shoe-tops dismissed him. If the young man you have described—
Yes, thank you. Mr. Pivner hurried into the bar and there ordered orange juice. He sounded weary and unprepared for surprises, even one so familiar as the dim image already resident, awaiting but the raising of his eyes in the tinted mirror. To one side of him, a blonde sagged slightly in his direction, her elbow edged nearer to his own, a gold cigarette case, and he politely averted his eyes to avoid reading the inscription, withdrawing, bumping the man on his right. Mr. Pivner cleared his throat as one prepared to apologize, but the other merely darted a pinpointed glance at him and turned away, straightening a lapel where hung a boutonniere shabby enough to appear in this light made of paper. And Mr. Pivner settled his rimless glasses back closer to his eyes to stare forth into the tinted glass whose length construed the three figures in vacancy, maintaining a dim reality of its own, embracing their shades in subterranean suspense. To one side the blonde opened her purse and exchanged a muffled pleasantry with the bartender. From the other side came a gasp. Mr. Pivner cleared his throat as though prepared to apologize, but unable to think so quickly of anything specific to apologize for. But the sharp eyes gleamed at something beyond him, and with such intensity that his own were drawn in a reflex to look to where the blonde paid for her drink. But all Mr. Pivner saw in the dim light was a crisp $20 bill exchange hands. Or so it looked to him, moon-blind in the tinted gloom of that landscape, where the three of them hung, asunder in their similarity, images hopelessly expectant of the appearance of figures, or a figure, of less transient material than their own. Chapter 7. We will now discuss in a little more detail the struggle for existence. Darwin, the Origin of Species. It reminds me, rather, of that convent, the one at Champignoul, was it? Near Dijon, said a tall woman, looking round her. The one that was turned into a madhouse. I know what you mean, said the girl beside her. Everyone keeps changing size. The tall woman looked at her quizzically, and noted that both of her wrists were bandaged. She took a step back. The girl took a step forward. What do you do? I? Why? When? Write? Oh, said the tall woman, recovering. I support my husband. He writes. He's an editor, you know. He's editing Esther's book. Who's Esther? Why, my dear, she's our hostess. There, talking with the tall fellow in the green necktie. She turned as her husband approached with a martini. What an interesting group of people, she said, and what interesting music. It's Handel, he said, handing her a glass. The triumph of truth and justice. She looked around her and raised the glass to her lips. Do you think next year we might get to the Narcissus Festival in Hawaii? Drinks were spilled. Another brown line burst on the mantel. People collided, excused themselves, and greeted one another. And Ellery, tucking the green silk tie back in his jacket, said, Just stop talking about it for a while. Who's that? He added, nodding at a blonde girl. I don't know. She came with somebody. She's going to Hollywood. I want another drink, Ellery said, and went toward the blonde. Ellery, please. But he was gone. She sat, holding her kitten. What does it mean? Said a heavy voice near her. The garbage cans in the street, the kids on the east side playing in the gutters, swimming in that filthy river. See? What does that mean? Well, she says Paris reminds her of a mouthful of decayed teeth, but I think Paris is just like going to the movies. A lovely little hotel near Saint-Germain. I don't think I crossed the river more than twice all the time I was there. I really lived on the left bank. It's so much nicer. The architecture, the cloud formations over there. Of course, if you like Alps, I found them a fearfully pretentious bore myself. I mean, what can you do with an Alp? He's still in Paris. He wrote that he's just bought one of those delightful Renaults.
"Oh, yes, I do love them. An original?" Esther stood up. Her face was flushed. The music disturbed her because it seemed the records were being played at random, one stray side of Handel after another in haphazard succession. She started toward the room which had been the studio where the music came from, and bumped into a person who was saying, "Do you mean you've never heard of Murtybing?" Before she was halfway across the room, her way was blocked by an immense, glistening countenance. "Baby, they told me you were looking for a doctor, and—" "Do you know of one?" Esther asked, too startled for poise. "No, but I'm looking for one, too. Maybe we can find one together." Esther found Rose sitting in the dark. "Isn't the music nice? I'm playing them," she said. "Yes, but perhaps he wouldn't want any of them broken, Rose." "Oh, I won't break them," Rose said, smiling at her in the dark. Suddenly Esther put an arm around her, and then as abruptly withdrew it, and left her there with the phonograph. "Wasn't it silly of me? I tried to kill myself twice in 2 weeks. The second time I was out for 2 days. Sleeping pills." "How many did you take?" 23. Why?" "I just wondered. It's always a good thing to know." Esther closed her eyes, as though shutting out sound, and moved on toward Don Bildow, whom she saw across the room talking with a gaunt man in an open collar, green wool shirt, and a stubby youth. "Yes, I'm almost finished it," said a woman beside her to the editor. "It's to be called Some of My Best Friends Are Gentiles. I'm so weary of these painful apologies from our sensitive minorities. I often think how nice it must be among dogs. A bulldog saying, 'There's a greyhound, there's a basset, a Pekingese.' None of them mind at all. They're all dogs. Here all you have to do is say a word like Jew or Catholic or Negro or fairy, and someone looks ready to cut you up." "I'm sorry to interrupt," Esther said, "but who is that fellow talking to Don Bildow? The tall one."
"He's a critic. I can't remember his name. He used to do books on old masses."
"The other one calls himself a poet," said the woman who had been talking. "He's a professional Jew, if you know what I mean." Nearby, a man smoking something from a box whose label said, "Guaranteed to contain no tobacco," spoke to a fluttering blond boy who, someone must eventually remark, resembled an œuf-dieu mayonnaise. The tall woman indicated him to her husband, with the query, "And who is that perfectly weird little person? He's been talking for simply hours about the solids in Uccello, wherever that is."
"He's one of our more sensitive writers," her husband got out, expelling air as though it were salt water.
"Yes," she murmured, "I can see he has a good deal to be sensitive about." She watched as the object of her gaze halted a pirouette of departure to say, "But all my dear friends are exotic, just all twisted and turned like the irregular verbs in any civilized language, and all from overuse," the tall woman said thoughtfully. "Yes, and I tried to read his book, didn't I?" she added, turning to the other woman who, she noticed now, was wearing a maternity dress in collapsed folds, the pregnancy foiled. Then, as though bringing a topic from nowhere, she smiled and said, "Will you bring me a drink?" to her husband. "I'm drinking for 2 now," to them both, and I don't know how he could have been so careless to the other woman. As Esther crossed the room, Herschel caught her arm. "Baby, you must hear what Rudy's given his maid for Christmas. A hysterectomy. Isn't that the most thoughtful thing you ever heard?" While the tall woman continued to stare toward the door where the sensitive youth fluttered an escape against the current of entrance. "At least I think that's who it was. I remember the picture on the book jacket posing with magnolias." She paused to add as he disappeared, "Or was that a book by Edna St. Vincent Millay?" and stepped aside for, "Big Anna! But what happened, baby? How did you get here?" "My Boy Scouts. I'll never speak to them again." "But I'm really upset about Rudy," Herschel went on. "That one called and has been in an auto smash somewhere. I have to find a doctor. And you're so pretty tonight, and your nose, you know what they say about noses. Now you just drink this, and we'll find you the cutest little doll doctor. Oh, so pretty for Christmas Eve, all red and shiny like a candy cane. In the doorway, Maud hung back.
Do you think we could just go join the baby and live in Sweden, Arnie?
Same thing there, he said. I'll get you a drink. Can you really tell I've got this shirt on inside out?
Someone was saying, rather like Pyramus and Thisbe, if you know what I mean. And of course everyone knows that he was so sensitive she had to put cotton in the bed springs the first time so he wouldn't be embarrassed. That person quieted, nodding at who came in the door. Others turned to see Agnes Day, who said immediately, "It's really the most god-awful thing. Will someone get me a drink? Is Stanley here?" "Who's Stanley?" "A funny boy with a mustache." She sat down looking round her, but Stanley had not arrived, and she was soon enclosed behind a curtain of trouser seats.
I really prefer books. No matter how bad a book is, it's unique. But people are all so ordinary.
I think we really like books that make us hate ourselves. But why doesn't someone just write a happy book? Maud had said that, but no one heard her. If you had a judge who looked like your daddy, wouldn't you trust him? She asked a youth who turned on her with, "Trust that old bastard, Christ, he doesn't even trust himself. Do you want to buy a battleship?" All Maud could say, looking round the room, was, "How do all these people know each other?"
"Christ only knows. Do you like the party?"
"It's a little Chavanais, don't you think?"
"Christ, yes."
Esther had retrieved her kitten and stood holding it too tightly. At her elbow someone said, "Well, Ruskin dated his life from the first time he saw them." "Well, of course Ruskin," said the other. "He was in town just last week, wasn't he?" said the tall woman. "I heard my husband talking about him. They had lunch together, I think. He's doing a book about stones?" Across the room, Ellery was turned toward her. He was talking to the blonde girl, laughing, listening to her. She stood almost between them. The length of her back faced Esther. The heels were high, shoes narrow, legs slightly bowed. The whole of her figure up to the shoulders was slim, as though waiting to be taken and turned and bent downward and back. Esther felt heavy, resting against the door jamb, shapeless, and her head was tired, full, aching dully. "All I want to do is rent a house in the south of France with 4 deaf-mutes," said someone near her. The room before her was clean, but in her own mind it existed with the permanence granted only to shambles. Tenants whom she had not met stood like fixed dwellers in her life, never to be dispossessed. They had been born to her as they were in their permanent blue suits and brown suits and black dresses and eyeglasses, permanently standing and turning, talking to and about one another, nourished and propagated by their own sounds and the maneuvering of cigarettes, leaving the act of life outmoded, a necessity of the past, a compulsion of ignorance. Men raised cigarettes in erect threat. Women proffered the olive-tongued cavities of empty glasses. "What's that music?" someone asked her. "I don't know. It's something of Handel's, I think," said Esther, pausing to listen to the strains of celebration written by the barber's son, who had learned to play on a dumb spinet, as the anachronistic morning sickness rose in her, and she put an arm across her sensitive breasts. Ellery blew a smoke ring toward her, a savage missile, which the blonde reached out and broke on the air. "You'd better ask this nice lady right here," said a man who was fluttering a pamphlet titled Toilet Training and Democracy in one hand, leading a 7-year-old girl with the other. "I'm the little girl from downstairs," the child said to Esther. "Mummy sent me up to ask you, could you give me some sleeping pills?" Esther set off with her to the bathroom, where they interrupted someone who was looking through the medicine cabinet. "Oh, sorry," he said. Just wanted to see if there were any razor blades here."
He left with difficulty. Emerging a minute later, she was caught forcefully by the wrist.
"Look, you've got a kitten. I've got to tell you the one about Pavlov and his kitten. You know Pavlov, he had dogs. Pavlov rang a bell and woofed. They salivated, remember? The dogs, I mean. Well, this time Pavlov has a kitten."
Voice and man were swept away, and Don Bildow was not where she had seen him. But Ellery was coming toward her, smiling. She raised her face, smiling, and he stopped short at the couch between them, where, sitting alone, was a man whose profession was as immediately obvious as that of the rickshaw boys of Natal who whitewashed their legs. A bow tie of propeller proportions stood out over extra-length collar bills on the white-on-white shirt, protected by many folds of a cloth which somehow retained the gracious dignity of transatlantic origin in spite of the draped depravity in its cut.
"Benny, I'm glad you got here."
"Business is business," said Benny, raising his glass.
"What do you think of the idea?"
"Terrific.
"I've got the guy all lined up. We're going to pay his family when he goes through with it, half now, half on delivery. But it's got to look accidental."
"Listen to this," said Benny. "I thought of this last night."
"What, an angle?"
"Well, I didn't know whether you wanted to gag it up or make it arty or what. You know. We could have built a nice artistic number around it, some ballet, with a storyline in the background. Sweet. Or I thought if you wanted to gag it up, we could make a kind of musical out of it. You know, girls exploding cigars."
"Yeah, but look, that's not quite—"
"I know, we couldn't do that angle anyway, the cigars. We've got a couple of good cigar accounts that would yell. No, the more I thought about it, the more I thought what you guys really want is stark human drama. The real thing. So, listen to this. I thought of this last night."
"Yeah?"
"From a church. He does it from a church steeple."
"Christ, Benny, you'll win the Nobel Prize for that. It's a natural."
"I figure how we can make it look accidental enough. There's this church up in the Bronx right across from a dancing school. We'll have the cameras up there doing a show on kids learning ballet dancing, see? Then, when we get the word, all we have to do is break in and dolly them around right out the window. Beautiful camera angle."
"But what about the priest? He might screw it up if he's around."
"He'll be around. He'll be busy inside saying a mass."
"It's terrific. That's all I can say." Ellery spoke with his eyes lowered in thoughtful admiration. Then he raised them. "You deserve a drink. Where'd you think of it, alone or in a story conference?"
"In church," said Benny.
"But Anna, baby," came a voice from the end of the couch, filling the gap of Ellery's marveling silence. "They boiled Sir Thomas More's head for 20 minutes just so it would hold together before they stuck it up on London Bridge."
"Right there," said the tall woman nearer Esther, "in front of God and everybody. That's the way those things always happen. Do you think I have on too much perfume? I have sinus trouble, and I never know. Isn't it warm in here?"
"Well, your fur piece," Esther began, turning to face her.
"I know, my dear, but to tell you the truth, I don't dare put it down anywhere."
"I'm sure it would be safe in my bedroom."
"Oh, then you're Esther. My dear, I'm sorry. I didn't mean—"
"It's all right. You're probably right. I don't know a lot of the people here myself."
"Tell me, Esther, has he come yet?"
"Who?"
"Your guest of honor, of course."
"Do you know him?"
"Hardly. But I've seen his picture so many times, and I own his book. I heard him speak once about families. I mean, about having children and that sort of thing. I can't bear them myself. I mean, bear them literally, you know," she laughed. "A tipped uterus, you know. There seem to be so many nowadays. You run into a tipped uterus wherever you turn." They both turned hopefully to look across the room where the door opened. "My dear, he is probably someone quite notable. You have to be to go about with an alarm clock strung around your neck." "Mandelson Schmandelson," someone else said. "I'm talking about music." "Wasn't that silly of me?" said the tall woman, watching Esther cross the room toward the couch. telling her a thing like that when here I am 2 months gone. It just goes to show what habit will do. I think Sibelius's fourth is his best. Fourth schmorth, it's his only. It just goes to show that you can't trust nature. Across the room, Mr. Feddle already was engaged in scribing a copy of Moby Dick. He worked slowly and with care, unmindful of immediate traffic, as though he were indeed sitting in that farmhouse in the Berkshires a century before. Maud looked up and said, "Isn't it funny how dark it seems over there? I mean where they are. Do they make the corner dark, or did they just gather there because it's dark there?" Then she saw that the heavy-set man was in uniform and said, "Oh, what are you?" "Army Public Relations," he said, looking up again at the group in the dark corner. "They look like something out of a Russian novel," he said. "Chavannes," said Maud, looking up at him with wide, unblinking eyes. "Yeah, him," said the officer. "Just because I'm not an intellectual don't mean I don't read books." Together they stared across the room, and Maud, feeling his warm hand on the back of her neck, relaxed somewhat. A few years before, someone who had once seen one rather unfortunate print of Mozart, it was in profile, the frontispiece in a bound score of the Jupiter Symphony printed in Vienna, and soon after looked once at the profile of the man now standing stoop-shouldered across the room in an open-collar green wool shirt, remarked that he looked, for all the world, like Mozart. Safe away by a century and a half, this was repeated often, most especially by those who persisted as his friends, wished to say something complimentary about him, and had never seen the frontispiece to the Vienna-bound Jupiter Symphony. "I know him. The tall one," Maud said. "He's been around a long time." He looked up as though he might have overheard her, and he looked offended. But if she had seen him more often, anywhere, and in any circumstance, she would have realized that he always looked offended. Bildow, who was talking, looked slightly offended. So did the stubby young man whose belligerent interest was poetry. They might have been offended by the conversation immediately beside them, a group as unattractive as their own, but in another way. Crackling with brittle enthusiasm, these guests pursued one another from the Royal Saint-Germain across the street to the Deux Magots, out to the Place des Vosges, and back to the Flore, across the river to the Boeuf sur le Toit, and back to the Brasserie Lippe. It was Goering's favorite place in Paris, you know. Briefly to the Carnavalet, and back to the Reine Blanche. "That's where I saw how tough the French police can be." "And laundry so expensive, 80 francs a shirt." "Of course none of us had baths in our rooms, but there was a charming boy from Virginia whose bathtub was always free after 11 in the morning. I managed very well, just washing in the bidet." Wherever encountered, it seemed that their one achievement had been getting across that ocean once and getting back to retail wares, which they deprecated but continued to offer. All they had in stock at present, though a sparkling variety was on order. "Cyprus sounded like a marvelous place. I heard that they have these trumpets there, and at night, when they go to bed, they put one end out the window, and the other end—" "We didn't get time to do Italy this time. Anyhow, it's really more important to get to know one place really well. We were in Paris for almost a whole week." Each one inclined from wistful habit to say, "Well, I've only been back a couple of weeks, and—" or "I just got back recently and—" or "Well, I've only been back a little while, but—" realizing in the back of their minds that seasons had changed since their return, that the same season they had spent there was approaching again here, realizing, in spite of those vivid images, which conversations like this one refurbished, that they were back, and their wares not for sale, but barter only, and in kind. "I guess it was Corfu, I meant. Anyway, when you walk down the street in the evening, you hear these really mellifluous sounds from these trumpets." "Well, we were there when our ambassador laid a wreath on the grave of the unknown soldier."
He dropped to his knees, and everybody in the crowd was so touched by his reverent act, then he fell flat on his face.
"You're talking about my husband," cried the one who had thanked Esther for her love-wee party in passing, paused then to make a face at Don Bildow over their shoulders, and went on. "I never saw anything like that, even at the Au Soleil Levant. What was it?"
"The Duchess of Ohio."
Bildow turned his unimpressive back. "There isn't a good lay in this whole room," said their stubby companion, with a look as though recalling some severe unkindness done him privately years before. It was, in fact, a look he seldom lost. The tall, stooped one undid the next button of his wool shirt, and said, "What about Esther? What about her?" "It's funny you never knew her. She was around a lot before she got married. That summer your wife shot herself, Esther was all over the place."
"I was at Yaddo," said the critic. He smoothed the hair on the back of his head, but it stood up again immediately he lowered his hand. And the likeness to the Mozart print was remarkable again, not for the heavy and long upper lip and the prominent nose, but the weight of the hair, which he wore as consciously as the 18th-century man, though not for reason of that infestation of daunted vanity known as fashion, but for his own unintimidated reason. It made his head look bigger, inferring its contents to be a brain of the proportions which science assures us we all might have if we had wings. "I heard you sold out," he said to Bildow.
"What did I have to do with it? You know how much it costs to run a magazine?"
He smoothed down and released his obedient hair. "Are you using my Dostoevsky piece in this issue?"
Not in this one, but—"
"Jesus Christ, you've had it up there for over a year. I'll finish the book before you print it, probably."
"Well, you know, there's politics up there like everywhere else."
"Who's out to get me?"
"Well, you know, that piece you did on Rilke last year, a lot of people—"
"Jesus Christ, whose fault was that? Everybody knows I wrote that Rilke's references were occasionally obscure, and that dumb Radcliffe girl I had typed obscene when she copied it. I'd like to know who the hell copyread that. And putting a T in genial."
"I was at Yaddo," said Bildow. Someone from the neighboring international set tried to join them, offering,
"Just imagine, Victor Hugo wanted the whole city of Paris named for him." This credential earned cold stares, frightening not for their severity, but for the very bleakness of the faces engaged.
"I hear you're going over," said Bildow's shorter friend, bleakly accusing.
"Yes, in a month or two I want to see for myself," said
Bildow, fingering his brown and yellow tie, bleakly defensive. Then he added, "It's funny that Max isn't here." "What's so funny about it?" "That wise bastard."
"He usually shows up at these cocktail parties," said Bildow.
"What the hell ever made you print that poem of his in the last issue? The one about beauty disdaining to destroy him, that one."
"Well, it was—"
"Did you see his paintings? Crap, all of them, even if he has got a sense of form."
"She looks like a good lay," said the stubby poet. "That blonde over there."
"Do you know who that is? It's that dumb goddamn Radcliffe girl, Edna, the one who screwed me up on that Rilke piece. The one thing I've written that's worth everything else put together, because I understood Rilke. I understood him because he understood suffering. He respected human suffering, not like these snotty kids who are writing now."
He put his glass down empty, saw another full, and picked it up before its owner had finished, saying, "It's like the movies because there's everything spread out for you, and you just have to react. Like at the movies, you don't have to pay with your real emotions. You don't have to do anything." "And who's that over there with all the queers around her? Agnes Day? Jesus Christ. I should think she'd get sick of playing mother to every goddamn fairy in the city." Esther had sat down on the couch because it was the only place in the room to sit. At one moment she had thought that if she did not sit down she might fall. But even now, sitting, she felt that she was falling, and she forced her back against the back of the couch, raising her chin as though trying to surface, for it was not a sense of tumbling through air, the limbs absurdly extended and unaccounted for towards sudden impact which would so abruptly account for their ridiculous efforts in an unalterable pattern of incongruous torsions, but of falling in water where no bottom waited to delineate finality. With penetration peculiar to distance, every sound seemed to reach her, though it was perhaps her own doing, trying to escape the sounds nearest her by straining for those beyond. Maladjusted to this? Well, thank God I am. If I wasn't, I'd go crazy, someone said across the room while she listened. But you've got to understand, New York. It's a social experience. That's why I like her. She's part woman, came a tittering asthmatic voice, and someone else was whistling slightly delayed accompaniment to a stretch of Handel's water music. The door opened, and she raised her head in hopeful anxiety, still unaware of how he would appear, the writer whom she had invited, and as afraid that he would not, and she lowered her eyes in disappointed relief, for the man who came in was carrying a baby, and immediately met by the girl with the bandaged wrists. "What did you bring it for?" she greeted him, then turned to say, "This is my husband. He's late because he's been tightrope walking. He has one set up in the apartment, and he says he can't practice when I'm around, and I'm around most of the time." In the middle of the room, someone greeted the boy who had been looking for razor blades in the medicine cabinet with, "Charles Dickens, my God, they told me you'd gotten a job as publicity agent for the Hiroshima Tourist Bureau. Come see the Atom City and all that kind of thing." The kitten tore at the arm of the couch. Esther caught it and drew it to her. Ellery's voice still the clearest in the room. He was talking to the blonde a few feet away. "Hollywood's through, honey. Why go way the hell out there when TV's right here in town? What do you think, Benny? Don't you like her for a spot in Lives of the Saints when it goes on video?" Esther realized that all this time the quiet, seated presence beside her had been eating. He followed a stuffed egg with a small hot frankfurter, then a fresh carrot. "I beg your pardon," she said. He made a sound, eating. "Are you a friend of—" "Hors d'oeuvres. All I ever get, hors d'oeuvres. I keep thinking Benny will take me somewhere where we'll eat, an invitation to dinner somewheres, but all I get is cocktail parties. All we do is drink all over town." "Are you in television, too?" "No, God help me. Benny and me went to school together." He coughed and took another small hot frankfurter, as though annoyed at this interruption in his meal. "Benny and me went to school together," he repeated. "See this suit? This is Benny's. He gave it to me." "It's a lovely suit," Esther said, looking at the gray flannel sleeve which came halfway down the man's forearm. "A very nice gift." "Now, it's too conservative for Benny. He can't wear things like this anymore, he says. Honest, you can't imagine a different guy than Benny when we went to school together, quiet and real serious. He was going to do great things then. He was going to design the most beautiful bridges you ever saw, and look at him now. Even a year ago I saw him and he was real, like the guy I used to go to school with. He isn't real anymore." The tray was abruptly lifted away, and he grabbed 2 frankfurters and a stuffed egg. "Look at them," he said, watching casual hands pick up stuffed eggs, frankfurters, and occasional carrot. "You'd think they were hungry the way they eat. Look at that woman with the white fingernails. Does she look hungry?" His meal was done, and he turned to Esther for the first time. "Do you know anything about player pianos?" "I'm afraid not. I've never really been interested." "I've written a history of the player piano, a whole history. It took me 2 years. It's got everything in it." "What's the matter with people? What do they want to read about? Sex all the time, politics. Why, did you know," he went on in a spicy tone, "the Crown Princess of Sweden, the Queen of Norway, the Sultan of Johor, all of them had player pianos? And Anna Held, Julia Marlowe, President McKinley, they had player pianos. And Pope Pius X, the Wright brothers, the ships of the Russian Navy." "If you want something to eat," Esther interrupted, "I'm sure that out in the kitchen—"
"Anything," he said, but his eagerness was weary, for just then art had taken appetite's place. "Someday I'm going to have it printed myself on Japanese onion skin, bound in vellum. I don't know. Am I the only one that's hungry? Doesn't anyone else ever eat in New York?" He stopped to pick some egg off the flannel sleeve. "White vellum with gold stamping."
"I'm sure that in the kitchen—" "Well, here you are." Benny stood over them unsteadily with a dripping glass in each hand. "Are you all right?" He leaned over and spoke to Esther in a low tone. "Are you keeping my friend here supplied? He always needs a drink, poor fellow. We went to school together. I've had to take him to every party in town the last 2 weeks. I don't know what he does with himself when I'm up at the studio." Esther felt that she had regained her strength and stood as the arm beside her reached dutifully up for the glass. She did not see Ellery and the blonde, and started toward Don Bildow when Herschel took her arm.
"Baby, there is a kitchen here, isn't there? Because we must have just a little butter. And, baby, has Rudy come yet? You know Rudy, don't you? You must. He designed this new Doukhobor dress. The one that comes off with a touch. Isn't that frightfully Tolstoy? And now he's designing sports clothes for nuns. Why, before he's through, he'll end up in the church himself. Isn't that too camp? Why, even Agnes says—"
"Bathysiderodromophobia, and that's only one of his troubles." "But why does simply everyone join the Roman Church when there are so many other divinely amusing religions around?"
"I think sun worship would be the most divinely inspiring thing. Why, just imagine everyone here running around without a stitch on."
"I'd like to start right now."
"I want a new Messiah." "Baby, we all do."
"That tall, stooped one in the open green shirt over there, I'd follow him anywhere."
"And it wouldn't do you a bit of good," said Agnes Day, leaning forward with a cigarette in her mouth, looking for a light. "He'd probably break every single little bone in your body."
"How ferocious! Agnes, introduce me, promise."
Of the 3 lights offered, Agnes Day leaned over one and then sat back, lowering her cigarette.
"Darling, he's not any stronger than you are."
"But he looks so intimate."
"He does," Agnes said, looking across the room. "And that's because he has myopia."
"Agnes, darling, you sound bitter. What's he to Hecuba, baby?"
"Oh, God, let's not talk about it. I spent most of a year listening to his troubles with his wife, with his childhood, with religion, with his work, honestly, nursing him."
"Agnes, how angry you are."
She had indeed got a stern look on her face which none of them had ever seen, but as quick as it had come it softened to one of weary disappointment. Then she said thoughtfully, not looking at anyone,
"The people who demand pity of you hate you afterward for giving it. They always hate you afterward."
She watched him plod across the room as though in deep snow. The front door was opened and closed 3 times in quick succession, the first draught catching the flower of Agnes Day's patronage to detach a frayed petal and waft it across the room.
"Buster! Sonny! But how did you get here?"
The second was Stanley, and the third a dark-skinned man about 5 feet tall in a snappy gray sharkskin suit, who looked round cheerfully, raised his eyebrows, shrugged, and accepted a drink. He was, in fact, the Argentine trade commissioner at the wrong party. Maud sat with her eyes closed, moving her head slightly in the hand of the man in uniform.
"I just don't do happy things any more," she was saying. "I guess because it's easier not to, because when you do and then remember them, it's much worse than if you never did them. It's much better if you don't have happy things to remember, and then you don't remember them and get sad because you're not doing them any more. It's easier just not to have anything to remember."
He leaned forward and blew softly into her hair.
"Who's loony now?" someone said, as Mr. Feddle worked his way along the wall with the care of coastal shipping not to venture into the open sea. His cargo was 7 pillars of wisdom, and he sought dockage where he might inscribe it in peace. Benny was approaching the very attractive girl who spoke with Boston accents. The tall woman said, "Then it's your husband who writes. What sort of thing?"
"God knows," said the girl with the bandaged wrists. "God and the Congregation of the Holy Office. Everything he writes goes right on the index, and I can't read it."
"Then you're Catholic?"
"My God, yes."
The very attractive girl, indicating Benny, turned to Ed Feasley and said, "Tell your friend I'm a lost horizon, will you?"
"Christ," Feasley said. "I don't know him. He looks like a brush salesman in that outfit. Maybe I can sell him a suit." She raised her eyebrows. "Well, Christ, I've got to do something. Ever since I smashed this last car up, I've been living on the free lunch at the Harvard Club and going through the cushions of the big chairs there looking for change that drops out of those old bastards' pockets. Christ!"
Benny turned unsteadily toward Agnes Day, but she had got up and gone to put an arm around Stanley, who shrank away. "Stanley, something awful has happened," she began, and looked over his shoulder to see the dark face of the critic.
"Hello," he said. "How is everything, Agnes?"
"Well enough, I suppose," she answered, and took her arm from Stanley's shoulders. "I didn't know you knew Esther."
"I just met her," he said. His tone was dull.
"How's your own novel coming along?" She sounded impatient.
"Well, I haven't finished it yet, but—"
"And the autobiography of Dostoevsky?"
"Look, Agnes, don't start that with me tonight. That autobiography crap."
"Relax," Agnes Day said. "Have another drink."
"All right. But just don't start."
"I'm not starting anything. Now relax."
"You must be having a good time here. I never saw so many queers in one room. Queers and uptown fluff and cheap advertising."
Agnes Day turned her back. "Stanley, I have something I want to talk to you about," she said, and led him back to her chair. Benny walked toward the other side of the room, where Ellery stood with the blonde backed up against a cabinet, his hand in the shadows there, hardly moving. Benny's lip was trembling. "Lady, lady," Esther felt her skirt being pulled and looked down to see the little girl from downstairs. "Mummy sent me up to ask you for some more sleeping pills." "Just a minute," she said as she looked and put her hand on the child's head. "You've got lots of friends, haven't you?" the little girl said, looking up at her. "Mummy used to, too, but not any more." "You must meet Mr. Crotcher," said someone to Esther beside her. It was Buster Brown, whom she did not know either. The pair had approached like a depraved version of Body and Soul, the one on little cat feet, as he himself remarked, the other in a brown suit of heavy material, nearer the floor with each step, as though wheeling a barrow full of cement. He shook Esther's hand with an air of great fatigue. "But you didn't tell us what you do," said Buster to him.
"I'm a writer," he answered.
"Oh, what sort of thing do you do?" Esther asked, dropping the weight of his hand and looking down as though she expected to see it drop to the floor.
"Right."
"Yes, but, fiction?"
"My book has been translated into 19 languages.
"I must know it," Esther said. "I must know of it."
"Doubt it," said the modest author. "Never been published."
"But you said—"
"I've translated it myself. 19 languages, only 66 more to go, not counting dialects. It's Celtic now, a lovely language, Celtic. It only took me 8 months to learn Celtic. It ought to go in Celtic."
"You mean be published?"
"Yes, published in Celtic. Sooner or later I'll hit a language where they'll publish it. Then I can retire to the country. That's all I want, to retire to the country." Ursa is next."
"It must be an awfully dirty book," said Buster. Mr. Crotcher gave him a look of firm academic hatred, which no amount of love in any expression could hope to erase.
"It is a novel about ant life," he said.
"Lady, could you take me into the bathroom?"
"You'll have to excuse me," Esther said, gripping the child's hand.
"Gee, lady," said the little girl as they crossed the room, "you ought to watch out for your baby."
"What?"
"You ought to change his pants," she said, pointing. Esther saw the baby on the floor, trying to climb the leg of a small, dark-skinned man in light gray. On the other side of the room, the girl with bandaged wrists was saying to her husband,
"What did you do with it?"
"Some girl borrowed it," he said. "You'll know her. She's got a green tongue."
"The baby's all right, if that's what you're talking about," said the tall woman.
"A nice-looking man seems to be playing some sort of a game with it." She turned to her husband and said,
"Who do you suppose that flashy little dago is?"
"But that's what's wonderful about France," someone said. "Simply everything is for sale."
"We've found the loveliest French restaurant," a girl said. "Everything is flavored with garlic. That's how you can tell."
She was interrupted by the Duchess of Ohio, who asked if her name was Maud.
"Why, no. Why?"
"They've told me that someone named Maud knows where you can get babies by post from Norway."
"Do you want one?"
"Baby, I feel like I'm going to have one." The girl stared.
"There hasn't been anything like this since the Moro Castle," said the tall woman, looking round. "I expect everyone to burst into 'Nearer, my God, to thee' at any moment."
"Christ, what a party," said a young man to Esther, stopping her as she came from the bathroom, the little girl dodging obstacles, running for the door. "Could I get you a drink?"
"It's my party, and you're very welcome," said Esther, feeling ill again.
"Oh, Christ, I'm sorry." Ed Feasley was folding together 4 dirty $5 bills. He put them into his pocket. "Damned lucky bit of business," he said.
"What?"
"You see that seedy-looking guy in the green shirt?"
"Oh, yes, I know him.
I just sold him a suit."
"But he doesn't look as though your suits would fit him," Esther went on automatically, making conversation.
"I wouldn't sell him one of my old things," Feasley said. "I told him to go up and get a suit at Brooks. He can charge it to my old man. What else am I supposed to do, sell a battleship?"
They stood looking over the room.
"How do you know all these people?"
"I really don't, to tell the truth," Esther said, looking for any she could identify.
There was James Leake, who said he had published a book called With Gun and Camera in Flatbush and Greenpoint, though no one had ever seen a copy, and was now at work exposing the Swiss conspiracy to dominate the world. There was Arthur, with a beard, who was writing a new life of Christ, to be published under another name, the same name he had used when he reviewed his first book, published under his own name, a satire on the Bible so badly received that he joined the chorus of its detractors and got even with himself by quoting Charles Reade and George Borrow, calling it an excrescence of over-refinement.
"Yes," he was saying to a girl named Izara. She had got that off a liquor bottle. Her real name was Mina Wessendorf.
"Of course, it's going to be autobiographical. All books are."
Someone else was saying, "When I finish this psychoanalytic critique of Mother Goose, I'm going right on to the Revelation of St. John the Divine."
Someone else said,
"She went into a cream dream talking about Ischia last night."
Nearby, someone asked about a slim, middle-aged man just out of earshot, who had been appointed instructor in one of the better Eastern boys' boarding schools.
"Well, I don't think he really realizes what he's doing. He just lies beside them and kisses them."
"It's all right, just so long as he doesn't turn them over."
"And where did you get those eyebrows?" someone in that corner asked the Duchess of Ohio, who was waving an old magazine.
"If I didn't have these eyebrows, I couldn't look so ferocious."
The magazine was Dog Days, open to the picture of champion dictator von Ehebruch. "Of course I believe in art," said a girl with a green tongue near them. "But not just to look at."
Christ, Christ, don't you wonder what they're trying to do, all of them? Look at this wild-eyed guy that just came in.
"God," said Esther, clutched his arm and thrilled him for an instant, left him dumb. Esther crossed the room, her face flushed, as though this abrupt challenge temporarily suspended the consuming terror which had become the fabric of her own life, just as the flush in her cheeks replaced the transparent whiteness which had come over her face only hours before.
"Look, where's your kitten? Only someone who loves kittens could understand."
"Please let go of me."
"But you've got to hear this, the kitten. Pavlov had an experiment with lights, and when he rang a bell, whoofed." "Esther!"
"Darling, haven't you had enough?"
"Esther, darling," the tall woman stopped her. "That music seems awfully loud, even for Bach. Darling, where are you going? What's the matter?"
The music was the great elopement. A chill horn raised her, twisted her up and exalted her for a moment, and then she was let go and lowered evenly on strings.
"He's here," Esther said, her flush already failing. "He's come. Here."
"He has? But I don't see anyone," said the tall woman, looking over the room with her head cocked back, drawing her eyelids to the level of her lashes, which did not move, and she looked quite disdainful. "Anyone who looks like a Quaker, certainly. Certainly no one whose picture I've ever seen on a book jacket." Then she lowered her face so quickly that the smooth, proud hollows where her eyes lay became furrowed, drawn together by the brows, and, "Who do you suppose?" she murmured, watching Esther hurry toward the door, and there seize the arm of a figure with neither hat nor coat nor tie, immediately obscured by her back.
"You've come back." "Here?" Esther said, almost in a whisper.
"I didn't know you had a party. I won't interrupt."
"But you come—"
Esther drew the arm she had seized to her in a convulsive gesture. Then, as though shocked at this, she almost let it go, but did not, turning toward the bedroom hall, trapped for an instant in the brown eyes of the critic upon her, a gaze she broke and went on, restraining the tension of the music in the wrist gone rigid in her hold.
"Come into the bedroom. All these people, it's not... Where have you been?" she asked when they gained the cover of the hall.
"In a Turkish bath," he answered promptly.
"Oh, no, close the door."
She sat on the edge of the bed, holding with a hand on either side of her, and looked at him. He started toward the closet. Then she said,
"You—"
and her voice quavered, so she stopped and made an effort to swallow, trying to draw together the great hollow behind her tongue.
"Almost as though I knew you were coming," she said, and then added, "and expected you."
At that he turned to her, and Esther shuddered, for his face was drawn in the mild surprise her memory knew so well, for here now, just as there, she had intruded upon him. There he was in her memory, usually seated, but sometimes standing at a window with his back turned, unaware of her approach, so that no matter the circumstances or her intentions, she became stealthy, and might even try to retire and leave him there. But he always turned like this, intruded upon, composing the lines of his surprise into expectation, looking at her, waiting. But all this happened very fast, and sometimes, before she knew it, she'd set fire to his hair, or saw it so. What was the difference? Or saw him streaming blood down the side of his face, as he had that morning when they had news that the warehouse, where his early paintings were stored, had burned, and he came in with a razor cut on his cheek. And this same mild expectancy, waiting to be told. But now he turned away.
"I've just come to pick up some things," he said,
and he stood there holding one hand in the other before him, looking down. She watched the lines of his face become confused again, and still sitting on the edge of the bed, she asked him, "What things?"
"Well, there must be some clothes. Some clothes, because this—"
He stopped again, holding a black wilted lapel, and looked at it.
"It's been so long," she said, starting to get up, but then she only clasped her hands around a knee and stayed. "Are you going away?" she asked him, and sorry she had, for he looked bewildered and not at her. "You're not going to stay?" she added abruptly.
"To stay?" he repeated, and looked at her.
"You haven't come back to stay? With me?"
Her knee slipped from his clasped hand.
"Why, no, I stopped in to pick up some things. There's somewhere I have to go tonight, something I have to do."
He spoke each word as though intending another, misshaping them with his lips, and stood there uncertainly.
"You see,
He commenced again, but she interrupted briskly as she stood.
"It's all right, I simply wondered. A woman likes to know these things."
But you
do look better than when you were up here a few days ago, don't you?" she went on, her voice with an edge to it.
"Yes, I'm tired."
"Where have you been?"
"A Turkish bath."
"All this time?"
"No, yes."
"Why? Why?"
"Oh, they do all sorts of things to you there. Heat and cold, and steam, and cold water. And they pound you, and they do all sorts of things to you to make you, that you feel—" He turned toward the closet again, took a step, and startled at his brief image in the mirror.
"Oh, but I'm sorry," she said, laughing, coming toward him around the foot of the bed.
"Well, I didn't think it was mine," he said, confused again, taking off the jacket he'd got from a closet hanger. Its bold plaid sleeves came down to his knuckles, the skirt well down over his thighs.
"I am sorry," Esther said, and she quit laughing. Someone left it here."
"But they're all like this," he said from the closet.
"Your things are in here in these drawers."
She stopped her going toward him and pulled open a bottom drawer. When she straightened up, she'd recovered her impatience.
"When you're away for as long as you've been," she began.
He was putting back on the wrinkled black jacket from the floor where he'd dropped it.
"But here," Esther said, pulling folded clothes from the drawer. "Surely there's something in here that will do better than that."
But he buttoned the jacket in front, taking both hands to each button.
"This," she said.
He took from her the suit she held out, plain gray with a diagonal weave.
"Well? Aren't you going to put it on?"
He folded it and put it on the bed, at the same time making sure of the buttons on the jacket he wore, as though suddenly afraid to lose it.
"Aren't you going to wear this?"
I'll take it with me, and a shirt. Some shirts, too." Then with a step he was nearer her, and another, and he stopped, bringing up his head, both hands open before him, open as though to come to grips, except that he'd already fallen half a step back.
She, straightening up with some shirts held forth on the flat of her hands, raised her face to his, joining forces with the mirror behind her. "What is it?"
But with that half a step back, one image retired, and bearing his green eyes on her, he recovered the half step and another with it, so that Esther shrank back against the chest, holding the shirts out farther still between them, and she repeated, "What is it?" The door opened, flung open. Music burst in.
"What do you—"
"Sorry!" Broken shapes, gray Glenn Urquhart, mitigated by blonde hair in a wild panache, shattered the wall. a peripheral pattern instantly restored as the door bangs closed.
What was it?
Purcell.
No.
Her hands lay in his under the squared white mass of the shirt's cold nails and soft-lined joints against his hard palms.
The music? No.
Her thumbs out, and palms up with the weight on them, her shoulders relax, and her hands open further, to draw up as instantly there is no support, first his right hand gone, clearly gone, and then, with an instant's paroxysm, the left. And then the weight of those shirts lifted away, and her hands rise empty, round-fingered, untapering and separate. The mass of the shirts broke on the bed as he dropped them there, and took his left hand in his right, where veins stood out in swollen tributaries, rising between the roughed mounds of the knuckles, breaking in detail on the fingers whose severity they articulated.
That night,
Esther said, staring at his hands, her own withdrawn to shelter the hollows, heels on bone and the round ends of her fingers appointing that soft declivity which rose above them until her thumbs could not meet across her waist.
That night,
she repeated, curling her finger ends in upon the yielding bank and the tips of her thumbs touched.
When I wanted to manicure you?
She looked up at his face, and with the effort smiled until she said,
And you drew away just like that.
Each word draining the smile from her face, and she lowered her eyes, and her empty hands came down to her sides. She waited and heard no response, but watching saw his lips go tight.
"What have you been doing all this time?"
she demanded of him, and sat on the bed. He turned back to the shirts, which he'd just left stacked unevenly on the bed, and commenced to arrange them in a careful pile.
"Nothing,"
he answered automatically.
"Nothing,"
she repeated, and sat up straight.
"A few things. Working, sort of. Experimental things." "Painting? What kind of things, then?"
"Yes, sort of. That kind of thing."
"Painting?"
He looked up at her, quickly and away, back to what he was doing, squaring the pile between his hands.
"Looking around us today," he said with effort, "there doesn't seem to be much that's worth doing."
"Well, what good is it, then?" she burst out at him. "Going on only to find out what's not worth doing."
"You find," he mumbled, "if you can find that way."
"Are you very ill?" Esther said.
"Ill?"
He looked up, pale and surprised.
"Everything is just like it was, isn't it? Only worse."
She started speaking rapidly again as she got to her feet.
"You've just got everything tangled up worse and worse, haven't you? Why, the way you pulled your hands away from me just now, as though they were something—"
"Esther."
"And your guilt complexes and everything else. It's just gotten worse, hasn't it, all of it? And the way you pulled your hands away from me just now, it was just like when we were first married and I hardly knew you, and the longer we were married, the less you— Won't you talk to me? Even now, won't you talk to me?"
"Really, Esther, I didn't come here to argue with you." He sounded again himself, she remembered, and she pursued.
"You won't argue. You'll say things like that, but you won't argue. You won't talk to me."
"Damn it, Esther, I just came in to get some things."
"Get them, then. Take them. Take them."
He busied himself folding the shirts up with the gray suit, tightening his lips against the sounds which escaped her.
"Because there's no one, is there? You're alone now, aren't you? Are you alone now?"
"Esther, good God. Please."
"Ignorance and desire, you've told me. Oh, you've told me so many things, haven't you? All of our highest goals are inhuman ones, you told me. Do you remember? I don't forget. But remorse binds us here together in ignorance and desire and not salt tears then, but—"
She gasped again, shuddered, but would not give in.
"And what is it now, this reality you used to talk about?" she went on more quietly. "As though you could deny? and have nothing to replace what you take away, as though— Oh, yes, 0 does not exist, you told me. 0 does not exist, and here I watched you turn into no one right here in front of me, and just a pose became a life, until you were trying to make negative things do the work of positive ones. And your family, and your childhood, and your illness then, and studying for the ministry, and— When I married you, we used to talk about all that intelligently, and I thought you were outside it and understood it, but you're not. You're not. And you never will be. You never will get out of it. And you never will let yourself be happy.
Esther was talking rapidly again, and she paused, as though to give effect to the softness of her voice as she went on, though her memory crowded details upon her, and it was these she fought.
There are things like joy in this world. There are. There are wonderful things, and there is goodness and kindness, and you shrug your shoulders. And I used to think that was fun, that you understood things so well when you did that. But finally, that's all you can do, isn't it? Isn't it?
He stood across the bed, holding his bundle up before him, meeting her eyes, provoked, and he smiled, ready to speak.
And your smile, she went on, even your smile isn't alive, because you abdicated. You moved out of life, and you—
But the past, he broke in. Every instant, the past is reshaping itself. It shifts and breaks and changes, and every minute we're finding, I was right, I was wrong, until—
Esther plundered the fragments her memory threw up to her, taking them any way, seizing them as they rose, and clinging to each one until she'd thrust it out between them.
The boundaries between good and evil must be defined again. They must be re-established. That's what a man must do, isn't it? A man! Wasn't it?
She paused, retaining hold on that for a moment longer, raising her hand to her forehead, in fact, as though doing so, considering its details, and lowering her voice.
Yes, you couldn't have a world in which the problem of evil could be solved with a little cunning, she added, word by word, dully. And you— Oh, yes, by confessing, to set up order once more between yourself and the world.
Esther's voice trailed off as she stared down at the bed between them.
Yes, go on. Go on with it,
he said eagerly when she stopped, staring at her. For as it happened, this point had come from a play she'd read shortly after Otto had sailed for Central America. A play by Silone called And He Hid Himself. But even now, looking up, Esther saw these words on the lips before her, slightly parted in expectation. She began again.
I wish—
Yes, you understand, he burst in. You understand. That's why this is crucial. You understand, don't you? How this is going to expiate.
Expiate?
She accepted him again, standing there with his hand out.
And that it isn't just expiation, but— That's why it is crucial. Because this is the only way we can know ourselves to be real, is this moral action. You understand, don't you? The only way to know others are real.
A wave of nausea rose through her body, and Esther gripped the corner of the night table behind her, swaying a little, swallowing again.
If we had had a child, she murmured. Yes, if we—
And you understand it, his voice came on at her. This moral action, it isn't just talk and words. Morality isn't just theory and ideas, that the only way to reality is this moral sense.
Stop it, she cried out. Stop it!
She caught herself and took up the handkerchief again quickly, for saliva was running from the corner of her mouth beyond the apprehension of her swallowing. "Moral sense?" she repeated loudly at him. "Do you think women have a moral sense? Do you think women have any morals? That women can afford them?"
Esther.
He started toward her round the end of the bed. "Oh, no," she said. "No! Do you know how much she has to protect, and every minute more? And you make these things up and force them on her? Men take their own guilt and call it moral sense and oppress her with it in the name of—" She shrank back as he came close to her. "In the name of Christ, why didn't you go on and stay where you came from and be a minister where you came from, instead of coming here where I—" she shuddered as he took her arm, "have so much to protect."
Esther, he said to her, that close.
"But now you are here," she said to him in a whisper. The nausea had fallen away abruptly as it had come, leaving her in his grip with her teeth chattering as she spoke, and her tears did not fall but spread evenly into the wetness of her cheeks. Two of her fingers sought his wrist and tried to close on it. "You," she articulated from a wild breath in his face. "Now you are here to stay and protect." They stood there with 3 senses locked in echo of the 4th, and she licked her lip. "Sorry!" The door banged against the wall. "They're still there, only talking." The door banged closed.
Esther, you don't understand?
His hand opened. "You're not going to—"
Not yet, because tonight, when I've done what I have to do—
"Not yet!" She stepped away as though she had broken from him. The clothes bundle fell to the floor. He put a hand out, and then withdrew it slowly and stooped to recover the clothes. Esther stared at the wrinkled black of his bent, unsteady figure only for a moment. Then she opened the handkerchief, wadded all this time in her hand, and blew her nose as she crossed the room to the mirror, and he backed toward the door.
"I'd better go," he said, from there.
She did not answer. She had picked up a lipstick and stood contorting her mouth, drawing generous lips. Then a rush of sound broke over her, and she looked up quick